The Sui dynasty's spectacular collapse began with Emperor Yang's catastrophic reign, a period marked by megalomaniacal construction projects and disastrous military campaigns that drained the imperial treasury and devastated the population. Yang Di, as he became known posthumously, had inherited a unified China from his father, Emperor Wen, but his relentless pursuit of grandiose schemes transformed prosperity into widespread rebellion. The Grand Canal project, while ultimately beneficial for Chinese civilization, consumed enormous resources and forced millions into brutal labour conditions. Simultaneously, Yang's obsession with conquering Goguryeo on the Korean peninsula resulted in 3 failed invasions between 598 and 614 AD, each more costly than the last. The third Goguryeo campaign proved particularly devastating. Yang mobilized over 1 million troops, including support personnel, creating a logistical nightmare that stretched across the empire's northern frontier. Supply lines collapsed, soldiers deserted in massive numbers, and the imperial army suffered crushing defeats against well-prepared Korean forces. The campaign's failure coincided with natural disasters throughout China, including floods along the Yellow River and widespread famine. These calamities created a perfect storm of discontent that ignited rebellions across the empire. By 613 AD, rebel movements had erupted in virtually every province. The most significant early uprising occurred in Shandong province, where a massive peasant rebellion led by hundreds of thousands of desperate farmers overwhelmed local garrisons. Similar revolts spread through Hebei, Henan and the Yangtze River Valley, each feeding off local grievances against heavy taxation, forced labour and military conscription. The imperial government's response proved inadequate as Yang continued to focus on his Korean ambitions while the empire burned beneath him. The situation deteriorated further when Yang retreated to his southern capital at Yangzhou in 616 AD, effectively abandoning the northern regions to rebel control. His absence from the traditional power centres around Chang'an and Luoyang created a leadership vacuum that ambitious military commanders and aristocratic families quickly moved to fill. The emperor's isolation in the south, surrounded by luxury while his empire crumbled, became a symbol of Sui incompetence that legitimised rebellion in the minds of both common people and elite families. Among the provincial governors watching these events unfold with calculating eyes was Li Yuan, Duke of Tang and military commander of Taiyuan in modern-day Shanxi province. Li Yuan represented everything the failing Sui dynasty was not: competent, pragmatic, and deeply connected to the military aristocracy that formed the backbone of Chinese political power. His family claimed descent from the Li rulers of the Western Liang dynasty, providing him with legitimacy that transcended mere military might. More importantly, his position in Taiyuan placed him at the crucial intersection of Chinese agricultural regions and the northern steppes, where Turkic tribes represented both threat and opportunity. Li Yuan's initial response to the Sui collapse demonstrated the careful political calculation that would characterize Tang governance. Rather than immediately declaring rebellion, he maintained nominal loyalty to the Sui while building his power base and observing how other contenders fared. His strategic patience allowed him to avoid the fate of premature rebels who were crushed by still functional Sui forces, while positioning himself to act when the moment proved optimal. The turning point came in 617 AD when Li Yuan finally moved against Sui authority, but his rebellion differed fundamentally from the desperate peasant uprisings that had preceded it. Li Yuan commanded professional soldiers loyal to his family rather than desperate farmers armed with agricultural tools. His forces included experienced cavalry units, skilled archers, and siege specialists capable of taking fortified cities. More crucially, he'd secured the support of his teenage son Li Shimin, whose military genius would prove instrumental in Tang's success. Li Yuan's most controversial but strategically brilliant decision involved forming an alliance with the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, traditional enemies of Chinese dynasties. This partnership provided him with approximately 2,000 Turkic cavalry, elite mounted warriors whose mobility and fighting skills far exceeded anything available to his rivals. The Turkic alliance also secured his northern frontier, preventing the nomadic confederation from exploiting Chinese civil war for their own territorial gains. Critics later condemned this collaboration with barbarians, but Li Yuan understood that unifying China required pragmatic alliances, regardless of traditional ethnic prejudices. The march toward Chang'an began in earnest during the summer of 617 AD. Li Yuan's army, now numbering approximately 30,000 troops, including his Turkic allies, moved south through the Taihang Mountains toward the Wei River Valley, where China's ancient capital lay. The campaign demonstrated Li Yuan's military acumen and his ability to inspire loyalty among diverse fighting forces. His soldiers included not only his original Taiyuan garrison, but also defectors from Sui armies, local militias seeking protection from bandits, and opportunistic commanders who recognized the changing political winds. The capture of Chang'an in November 617 AD marked a decisive moment in Chinese history. The city, which had served as capital for the Han Dynasty and would become the Tang capital, represented far more than mere real estate. Control of Chang'an provided access to the Wei River Valley's agricultural wealth, the symbolic legitimacy of ruling from China's traditional power centre and strategic position for controlling the empire's western regions. Li Yuan's forces encountered minimal resistance as they approached the city, since most Sui defenders had either fled or switched sides. The fall of Chang'an occurred with surprising ease, reflecting the complete collapse of Sui authority in the region. Local officials opened the city gates rather than face a siege they knew they could not win. Li Yuan's troops entered the capital in disciplined formation, avoiding the looting and destruction that typically accompanied such conquests. This restraint served multiple purposes. It preserved the city's infrastructure for future Tang use, demonstrated Li Yuan's fitness to rule through his control over his soldiers, and reassured the urban population that the new regime would bring stability rather than chaos. Upon securing Chang'an, Li Yuan faced the delicate task of legitimizing his rebellion while maintaining the fiction of imperial continuity. Rather than immediately declaring himself emperor, he installed Yang Yu, Emperor Yang's grandson, as a puppet ruler while assuming the title of regent. This arrangement allowed Li Yuan to exercise imperial authority while avoiding the stigma of regicide and usurpation. The puppet emperor served as a useful transitional figure who could issue edicts in the Sui name, while Li Yuan consolidated his position and eliminated remaining rivals. The formal establishment of the Tang Dynasty came in 618 AD, following news of Emperor Yang's assassination by his own generals at Yangzhou. With the last legitimate Sui ruler dead, Li Yuan's path to the throne became clear. On June 18, 618 AD, he formally abdicated the puppet emperor and proclaimed himself Emperor Gaozu of the Tang Dynasty, marking the beginning of what would become one of China's greatest imperial houses. The coronation ceremony, held in Chang'an's imperial palace, combined traditional Chinese rituals with innovations that would characterize Tang governance. Emperor Gaozu's early governmental structure reflected both continuity with previous dynasties and significant innovations adapted to Tang circumstances. The new emperor retained the basic framework of Chinese imperial administration, including the 6 ministry system that managed personnel, revenue, rituals, war, justice, and public works. However, he modified this structure to accommodate the military realities of his rise to power and the diverse coalition that had brought him to the throne. Military commanders who had supported his rebellion received prominent positions in the new government, while experienced Sui administrators who had surrendered were integrated into the bureaucracy to maintain governmental continuity. The Tang legal system, established during these early years, demonstrated Gaozu's commitment to creating stable institutions rather than merely personal rule. The new dynasty's legal code built upon Sui precedents while incorporating military law traditions that reflected the Tang's origins as a warrior regime. This legal framework emphasized clear hierarchies, defined punishments for various crimes, and established procedures for governmental decision-making that would endure throughout the dynasty's existence. Gaozu's early reign also witnessed significant military reforms that transformed the Tang army from a collection of allied forces into a professional imperial military. The Fubing system, which would become central to Tang military organisation, began taking shape during this period. This militia system combined agricultural production with military service, creating a self-supporting army that could be deployed throughout the empire without bankrupting the treasury. Soldiers received land grants in exchange for military service, creating a class of farmer warriors with direct stakes in the dynasty's success. Despite these early successes, Gaozu faced numerous rival claimants who controlled substantial territories and commanded significant military forces. The most formidable of these competitors was Wang Shichong, who had established himself as emperor of a rump Sui state centered on Luoyang. Wang commanded approximately 100,000 troops and controlled the economically vital Central Plains region. His forces included experienced Sui veterans, local militias, and mercenary units drawn from across northern China. Wang's strategic position in Luoyang allowed him to threaten Tang supply lines, while maintaining access to the Grand Canal's transportation network. The conflict with Wang Shichong developed into a prolonged campaign that tested Tang military capabilities and political resolve. Wang's forces proved more resilient than expected, utilizing defensive strategies that maximized their advantages while avoiding direct confrontation with Tang cavalry units. The Siege of Luoyang, which began in 619 AD, demonstrated the evolving nature of Chinese warfare as both sides employed sophisticated siege engines, coordinated infantry and cavalry tactics, and complex logistical systems to support extended campaigns. Simultaneously, Gaozu confronted the challenge posed by Du Jiande, who had established an independent kingdom in Hebei province with its capital at Ledu. Du's forces, numbering approximately 80,000 troops, controlled the strategic region between the Yellow River and the northern frontier. His army included significant cavalry components and had proven effective against both Sui forces and other rebel groups. Du's kingdom represented a particular threat because of its proximity to the Tang capital and its potential for alliance with other anti-Tang forces. The military campaigns against these rivals reveal the tactical genius of Li Shimin, Gaozu's second son, who emerged as the Tang Dynasty's premier military commander. Li Shimin's approach to warfare combined traditional Chinese military principles with innovations adapted from Turkic cavalry tactics and siege warfare techniques learned during the conquest of Chang'an. His ability to coordinate complex multi-front campaigns while maintaining supply lines across vast distances demonstrated strategic capabilities that would define Tang military success. The decisive confrontation with Wang Shichong and Du Jiande came in 621 AD when the two rival rulers formed an alliance against the Tang. This coalition represented the most serious threat to Tang survival, as it combined Wang's defensive expertise with Du's mobile cavalry forces. The alliance controlled territory stretching from Luoyang to the northern frontier, effectively surrounding Tang holdings and threatening to strangle the new dynasty in its infancy. Li Shimin's response to this crisis showcased the tactical flexibility that would characterize Tang military doctrine. Rather than attempting to fight both enemies simultaneously, he focused on maintaining the siege of Luoyang while preparing to intercept Du Jiande's relief force. When Du's army approached Luoyang in May 621 AD, Li Shimin abandoned the siege temporarily to confront this more mobile threat in open battle. The resulting engagement at Hulao Pass demonstrated Tang's superiority in coordinated cavalry and infantry operations, resulting in Du Jiande's capture and the destruction of his army as an effective fighting force. With Du Jiande eliminated, Wang Shichong's position became untenable. His forces, demoralized by their allies' defeat and weakened by months of siege, could no longer maintain effective resistance. Wang's surrender in July 621 AD marked the end of organized opposition to Tang rule in northern China, though smaller rebel groups continued operating in remote regions for several more years. The completion of these campaigns by 621 AD established Tang control over the Chinese heartland and demonstrated the new dynasty's military effectiveness to potential rivals throughout the empire. The victories also provided the Tang with enormous quantities of captured equipment, experienced soldiers who could be integrated into Tang forces, and territorial control that generated the tax revenue necessary for further expansion. Most importantly, these successes established Li Shimin's reputation as a military genius and positioned him as heir apparent to his father's throne, setting the stage for the reign that would elevate Tang China to unprecedented heights of power and cultural achievement. The consolidation of Tang power under Emperor Gaozu had barely settled when the dynasty faced its most dangerous internal crisis. By 624 AD, tensions between Gaozu's sons had reached a breaking point that threatened to tear apart the empire Li Shimin's military genius had helped create. The root of this conflict lay in the fundamental question of imperial succession, complicated by the competing claims and ambitions of three exceptionally capable princes who each commanded significant military and political resources. Li Jiancheng, the crown prince and Gaozu's eldest son, had established himself as the legitimate heir through birthright and his father's formal designation. His position in Chang'an allowed him to cultivate relationships with court officials, manage imperial administration, and present himself as the stable, conventional choice for succession. Li Jiancheng commanded respect among conservative officials who valued traditional succession practices and worried about the precedent of bypassing the eldest son. His supporters included many civilian administrators who had served under the Sui dynasty and preferred gradual reform over dramatic change. Li Yuanji, the youngest of the three brothers, had emerged as a formidable military commander in his own right, though his achievements were overshadowed by Li Shimin's spectacular victories. Li Yuanji controlled significant cavalry forces and had proven effective in campaigns against Turkic raiders along the northern frontier. His military experience, while less extensive than his middle brothers, had earned him the loyalty of several thousand professional soldiers who viewed him as their direct commander, rather than a distant imperial prince. Li Shimin occupied the most complex position among the three brothers. His military victories had made him indispensable to Tang's survival, yet his very success created suspicion about his ultimate ambitions. By 625 AD, Li Shimin commanded the personal loyalty of the empire's most effective military units, including elite cavalry formations and siege specialists who had served under him in the campaigns against Wang Shichong and Du Jiande. His supporters included not only military officers, but also younger court officials who admired his energy and vision for expanding Tang power beyond traditional Chinese boundaries. The political maneuvering between these factions intensified throughout 625 AD, as each brother sought to position himself for the eventual succession. Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji formed an alliance against their middle brother, recognizing that Li Shimin's military reputation and popular support made him the greatest threat to their respective ambitions. This coalition began systematically undermining Li Shimin's position at court, questioning his loyalty to their father and suggesting that his military successes had made him dangerously ambitious. Emperor Gaozu found himself caught between his son's competing claims, unable to resolve the succession crisis without potentially triggering civil war. The aging emperor's indecision reflected both his genuine affection for all three sons and his recognition that choosing any one of them might provoke the others to rebellion. Gaozu's attempts to balance their competing interests by assigning them different responsibilities only intensified their rivalry, as each brother interpreted imperial favour toward his siblings as evidence of discrimination against himself, The crisis reached its climax in the early summer of 626 AD when Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji began planning Li Shimin's elimination. Intelligence reports reaching Li Shimin's supporters indicated that the Crown Prince intended to have his middle brother arrested on charges of treason, followed by a swift execution that would remove the primary obstacle to traditional succession. The plot involved key court officials loyal to Li Jiancheng, palace guards under Li Yuanji's command, and a coordinated propaganda campaign designed to justify Li Shimin's death as necessary for imperial stability. Li Shimin's response to this threat demonstrated the decisive leadership that would characterize his later reign as emperor. Rather than fleeing Chang'an or attempting to negotiate with his brothers, he chose to strike first with a carefully planned preemptive attack. The operation required precise timing, absolute secrecy, and the coordination of multiple military units within the heavily guarded imperial palace complex. Li Shimin's ability to organize such a complex undertaking while maintaining the appearance of normal court routine revealed sophisticated planning capabilities that extended far beyond battlefield tactics. The Xuanwu Gate incident unfolded on July 2nd, 626 AD, when Li Shimin and his supporters ambushed Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji as they entered the palace for what they believed was a routine imperial audience. The location was strategically chosen. The Xuanwu Gate served as the northern entrance to the imperial palace, a narrow passage that prevented Li Shimin's targets from bringing large escort forces while providing his own men with defensive positions from which to control the engagement. Li Shimin personally participated in the ambush, demonstrating the hands-on leadership style that had made him effective in military campaigns. When Li Jiancheng attempted to flee after realizing the trap, Li Shimin pursued him on horseback and killed his eldest brother with arrows fired from close range. The Crown Prince's death occurred within sight of the palace walls, emphasizing the dramatic nature of this succession struggle and the personal stakes involved for all participants. Li Yuanji's death followed shortly afterward, as Li Shimin's supporters overwhelmed the youngest brother's small escort force. The speed and efficiency of these killings prevented any organized resistance from forming, while the location within the palace complex ensured that news of the brothers' deaths reached Emperor Gaozu before their supporters could mount a counterattack. Li Shimin's men secured the palace gates and established control over key administrative buildings, effectively presenting the emperor with a fait accompli that left him no choice but to accept his middle son's actions. Emperor Gaozu's immediate reaction to the Xuanwu Gate incident reflected both shock at his son's deaths and pragmatic recognition of the new political reality. The emperor found himself confronted by Li Shimin's armed supporters in his own palace, with his designated heir dead and his youngest son eliminated as a potential alternative. Gaozu's decision to abdicate in favour of Li Shimin came after several days of tense negotiations during which the emperor gradually accepted that resistance would only lead to further bloodshed and potential civil war. The formal abdication ceremony on September 4th, 626 AD, marked Li Shimin's transformation from successful prince to Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty. The new emperor's choice of the reign name Taizong, meaning great ancestor, signalled his intention to establish a new standard for imperial governance rather than merely continuing his father's policies. The coronation combined traditional Chinese imperial rituals with innovations that reflected Taizong's military background and his vision for expanding Tang power throughout East Asia. Emperor Taizong's first priority involved consolidating his position by eliminating potential threats from his deceased brother's supporters while demonstrating magnanimity toward those willing to accept the new regime. The emperor ordered the execution of Li Jiancheng's and Li Yuanji's adult male children, following traditional Chinese practice of eliminating potential claimants to prevent future rebellions. However, he showed mercy to officials who had served his brothers, integrating many of them into his own administration and demonstrating that competent service would be rewarded regardless of past loyalties. The new emperor's administrative reforms began immediately with a comprehensive reorganization of the imperial government, designed to prevent the succession crisis that had nearly destroyed the Tang Dynasty. Taizong perfected the 3 chancelleries and 6 ministries system that would become the standard model for Chinese imperial administration for the next 13 centuries. The 3 chancelleries, the Imperial Chancellery, the Imperial Secretariat, and the Department of State Affairs, created a system of checks and balances that prevented any single official or faction from accumulating excessive power. The Imperial Chancellery served as the Emperor's personal advisory body, staffed by scholars and experienced administrators who could provide informed counsel on policy matters. These officials reviewed proposed edicts and regulations before they reached the Emperor, ensuring that imperial decisions reflected careful consideration of their implications and consequences. The chancellery system also provided Taizong with multiple sources of information about conditions throughout the empire, reducing his dependence on any single group of advisors. The Imperial Secretariat functioned as the primary drafting body for imperial edicts and correspondence, transforming the Emperor's decisions into formal documents that could be implemented by provincial and local officials. This institution required officials with exceptional literary skills and deep knowledge of precedent, as imperial edicts needed to conform to established legal and administrative traditions while addressing contemporary problems. The Secretariat's work ensured consistency in imperial communications and helped maintain the dignity and authority of imperial pronouncements. The Department of State Affairs coordinated the activities of the 6 ministries, each responsible for specific aspects of imperial administration. The Ministry of Personnel managed the appointment, promotion, and evaluation of government officials throughout the empire. The Ministry of Revenue oversaw tax collection, government finances, and the management of state-owned resources including agricultural lands, mines, and workshops. The Ministry of Rituals supervised court ceremonies, religious observances, and the examination system used to select government officials. The Ministry of War administered the imperial military, including the recruitment and training of soldiers, the maintenance of weapons and equipment, and the coordination of campaigns against external enemies. The Ministry of Justice managed the legal system, supervising courts throughout the empire and ensuring consistent application of imperial law. The Ministry of Public Works oversaw construction projects, transportation infrastructure, and water management systems essential for agricultural productivity and urban development. Taizong's refinement of this administrative structure included innovations designed to improve efficiency and prevent corruption. The Emperor established regular reporting requirements that forced ministry officials to provide detailed accounts of their activities and expenditures. He also created inspection circuits that sent imperial representatives to provinces throughout the empire, providing independent assessments of local conditions and official performance. These reforms created an administrative system capable of governing an empire that would eventually stretch from Korea to Central Asia. The equal field system, known as Juntianji, represented one of Taizong's most significant domestic reforms. This land distribution program aimed to provide every adult male with sufficient agricultural land to support his family while ensuring adequate tax revenue for the imperial government. The system allocated approximately 100 miyu of land to each adult male, with additional grants for family members and provisions for returning land to the state upon the recipient's death. This arrangement created a class of small farmers with direct stakes in the dynasty's success, while preventing the concentration of agricultural land in the hands of wealthy families and medullahs. Implementation of the equal field system required massive administrative effort, as officials needed to survey available land, register eligible recipients, and monitor compliance with system requirements. The program worked most effectively in newly conquered territories where the Tang government could distribute land confiscated from defeated enemies or previously uncultivated areas brought under imperial control. In established agricultural regions, implementation proved more difficult due to existing property rights and the political influence of established landowners. The military reforms accompanying these administrative changes transformed the Tang army into the most effective fighting force in East Asia. Taizong expanded the Fubing system initiated during his father's reign, creating a network of military agricultural colonies that provided both food production and the military service. Fubing soldiers received land grants in exchange for military obligations, including regular training, garrison duty, and participation in imperial campaigns. This system created a professional military force that could be maintained without the crushing tax burden that had contributed to the Sui dynasty's collapse. The Fubing system's effectiveness depended on careful selection of military colonists and strategic placement of their settlements. Taizong's officials chose soldiers based on their physical fitness, military experience, and loyalty to the Tang Dynasty. The colonies were established along frontier regions where military threats were most likely to emerge, creating a defensive network that could respond quickly to invasions while providing early warning of enemy movements. The system also included provisions for rotating soldiers between agricultural work and active military duty, ensuring that Fubing units maintained their fighting effectiveness while contributing to economic productivity. Emperor Taizong's military ambitions extended far beyond defending existing Tang territory. His strategic vision encompassed the creation of a Chinese empire that would dominate East Asia through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic alliance, and cultural influence. This expansionist program began with campaigns against the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, the nomadic confederation that had both aided and threatened Chinese dynasties for generations. The Eastern Turks under Jeli Khan had grown increasingly aggressive during the early Tang period, launching raids deep into Chinese territory and demanding tribute payments that strained imperial resources. Jeli's forces included approximately 200,000 warriors organised into highly mobile cavalry units capable of striking Chinese settlements and withdrawing before imperial forces could respond effectively. The Turkic Confederation also maintained diplomatic relationships with other nomadic groups and Chinese rebel factions, creating a potential coalition that could threaten Tang survival. Taizong's response to the Turkic threat demonstrated the strategic patience and careful preparation that characterized his approach to military challenges. Rather than launching immediate counterattacks that might fail due to inadequate preparation, the emperor spent several years strengthening Tang military capabilities while exploiting divisions within the Turkic Confederation. Chinese diplomatic missions worked to separate Jeli Khan from his tribal allies, offering alternative arrangements to Turkic leaders who might be willing to abandon the Confederation in exchange for Chinese recognition and material benefits. The decisive campaign against the Eastern Turks began in 629 AD, when Taizong judged that Tang forces had achieved sufficient strength and Turkic unity had weakened sufficiently to ensure victory. The emperor appointed Li Jing, one of his most capable generals, to command an army of 100,000 troops, including infantry, cavalry, and siege specialists. Li Jing's force represented the largest military expedition launched by the Tang Dynasty to that point, demonstrating Taizong's commitment to eliminating the Turkic threat permanently rather than merely repelling the latest round of raids. The campaign's success exceeded even Taizong's optimistic expectations. Li Jing's forces advanced rapidly across the northern steppes, utilising superior logistics and coordination to maintain their effectiveness across vast distances. The Tang army's combination of Chinese infantry discipline and cavalry tactics learned from Turkic allies proved devastatingly effective against traditional nomadic fighting methods. Jeli Khan's forces, weakened by defections and internal disputes, could not mount effective resistance against the Chinese advance. The capture of Jeli Khan in 630 AD marked the complete collapse of Eastern Turkic power and established Tang hegemony across the northern steppes. The former Khan's submission to Emperor Taizong in the Chinese capital provided dramatic evidence of the dynasty's military success and attracted diplomatic missions from nomadic groups throughout Central Asia, seeking accommodation with the new regional hegemon. The victory also yielded enormous quantities of livestock, precious metals, and skilled craftsmen who could contribute to Tang economic development. The death of Emperor Taizong in 649 AD marked a pivotal transition in Tang history, as power passed to his ninth son Li Ji, who ascended the throne as Emperor Gaozong. Unlike the dramatic succession crisis that had brought Taizong to power, this transition proceeded smoothly according to established precedent, reflecting the institutional stability that Taizong's reforms had created. Gaozong, 21 years old at his accession, had been carefully prepared for rulership through education in classical literature, military strategy, and administrative practice. However, the new emperor's personality differed markedly from his father's decisive and energetic character. Where Taizong had been bold and personally involved in military campaigns, Gaozong proved more cautious and inclined to delegate authority to trusted advisors. The early years of Gaozong's reign demonstrated both continuity with Taizong's policies and subtle shifts that would have profound long-term consequences. The emperor maintained his father's administrative structure, retaining experienced officials who had served under the previous regime, while gradually introducing his own appointments to key positions. The 3 chancelleries and 6 ministries system continued functioning effectively, providing stable governance during the transition period. However, Gaozong's more collaborative leadership style created opportunities for influential court figures to exercise greater authority than they had enjoyed under Taizong's more centralized approach. The most significant development during Gaozong's early reign involved his relationship with Wu Xiao, a former concubine of Emperor Taizong who had entered the palace as a 14-year-old in 638 AD. Following Taizong's death, Wu Xiao had been sent to Ganya Temple to become a Buddhist nun, as was customary for deceased emperors' concubines. However, Gaozong had developed a romantic attachment to Wu Xiao during his father's lifetime, and in 651 AD he recalled her from the convent to serve as his concubine. This decision violated traditional protocols regarding imperial succession and created scandal among conservative court officials who viewed such behaviour as improper and potentially destabilising. Wu Xiao's return to court initiated one of the most remarkable political careers in Chinese history. Born into a merchant family in Lizhou, she possessed exceptional intelligence, literary skills, and political acumen that distinguished her from other imperial concubines. Unlike most women in the imperial harem, Wu Xiao actively sought to understand and influence government policy, studying administrative documents and cultivating relationships with key officials. Her background outside the traditional aristocratic families that typically supplied imperial consorts provided her with different perspectives on governance and fewer constraints from established family interests. The new concubine's rise within the imperial hierarchy proceeded with calculated precision. Wu Xiao first focused on eliminating rivals within the harem, particularly Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, who represented obstacles to her advancement. In 654 AD, a mysterious incident involving the death of Wu Xiao's infant daughter provided the pretext for accusations against Empress Wang. Wu Xiao claimed that the empress had murdered the child out of jealousy, charges that could not be definitively proven, but created sufficient suspicion to undermine Wang's position. The incident demonstrated Wu Xiao's willingness to use extreme measures to achieve her political objectives and her skill in manipulating court intrigue to her advantage. Emperor Gaozong's decision to depose Empress Wang and elevate Wu Xiao to empress in 655 AD shocked the imperial court and created lasting opposition among traditional officials. The deposition required overcoming substantial resistance from senior ministers who argued that such unprecedented action violated established precedent and threatened imperial stability. Chancellor Chu Suiliang and other veteran officials who had served under Taizong opposed the change vehemently, warning that Wu Xiao's elevation would set dangerous precedents and undermine respect for imperial authority. Their resistance reflected both genuine concern about constitutional propriety and anxiety about Wu Xiao's unconventional background and ambitious personality. The controversies surrounding Wu Xiao's elevation revealed fundamental tensions within Tang governance between imperial prerogative and bureaucratic tradition. Gaozong's determination to proceed despite official opposition demonstrated the emperor's authority to make personnel decisions affecting his own household, but the bitter resistance he encountered indicated that such decisions carried broader political implications. The emperor's eventual success in overcoming this opposition required dismissing or demoting several senior officials, creating resentment among the bureaucratic class that would influence court politics for decades. As empress, Wu Zhao immediately began expanding her political influence beyond the traditional boundaries of imperial consorts' activities. She attended court sessions where policy matters were discussed, offered opinions on administrative appointments, and developed independent relationships with government officials. This level of political involvement by an empress was unprecedented in Chinese history, where imperial wives typically confined their activities to ceremonial functions and harem management. Wu Zhao's active participation in governance reflected both her personal ambitions and Gaozong's willingness to share authority with someone whose judgment he trusted. The empress's growing influence coincided with Emperor Gaozong's development of a chronic illness that affected his vision and caused severe headaches, conditions that modern medical historians believe may have been symptoms of hypertension or stroke. These health problems, which became apparent around 660 AD, limited Gaozong's ability to handle the demanding schedule of imperial duties and created opportunities for Wu Zhao to assume greater responsibilities. The emperor's reliance on his wife's assistance in managing government business gradually evolved into a de facto co-rulership that formalized Wu Zhao's position as the real power behind imperial decisions. During this period, the Tang Empire continued the territorial expansion that had characterized Taizong's reign, with military campaigns extending Chinese influence deeper into Central Asia and toward the Korean peninsula. The conquest of the Western Turkic Khaganate, completed in 657 AD, established Tang control over the Tarim Basin and opened direct access to the Silk Road trade networks that connected China with Persia and the Byzantine Empire. This expansion required maintaining garrisons across vast distances and managing relationships with dozens of local rulers who had submitted to Chinese authority while retaining considerable autonomy in their internal affairs. The administration of these newly conquered territories presented complex challenges that tested Tang governmental capabilities. Unlike the agricultural regions of China proper, where the equal field system and established administrative structures could be implemented relatively easily, the Central Asian territories required different approaches adapted to nomadic societies and oasis-based agriculture. Tang officials developed a flexible system of indirect rule that allowed local leaders to maintain their positions, while accepting Chinese oversight and contributing to imperial military campaigns when required. The Korean campaigns of Gaozong's reign represented the most ambitious and costly military undertakings of the period. The emperor's decision to renew Chinese efforts to conquer Goguryeo reflected both strategic concerns about Korean independence and personal desire to complete the unfinished business of previous dynasties. Goguryeo, centered in northern Korea and southern Manchuria, commanded formidable military resources and had successfully resisted Chinese invasions for generations. The kingdom's strategic position allowed it to threaten Chinese interests in Liaodong, while potentially allying with other regional powers against Tang expansion. The first major Korean campaign began in 661 AD with a massive military expedition involving over 100,000 Chinese troops, supported by naval forces and allied contingents from Baekje, one of the three Korean kingdoms. The campaign's initial phase achieved significant success, with Tang forces capturing several important fortresses and advancing deep into Goguryeo territory. However, the logistical challenges of maintaining such large forces across difficult terrain, combined with determined Korean resistance and harsh winter conditions, prevented the Chinese from achieving decisive victory. The complexity of Korean politics added another dimension to these military campaigns. The three Korean kingdoms, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, maintained shifting alliances that Tang diplomats sought to exploit for Chinese advantage. Initially, the Tang had allied with the Silla against Goguryeo and Baekje, but Silla's growing strength and territorial ambitions eventually brought it into conflict with Chinese interests. This diplomatic complexity required Tang officials to balance military pressure with political maneuvering, seeking to prevent the emergence of a unified Korean resistance while advancing Chinese territorial objectives. Wu Zhao's influence on these military campaigns demonstrated her growing authority over imperial policy. The Empress advocated for aggressive prosecution of the Korean Wars, arguing that Chinese prestige required completing the conquest regardless of costs. Her position reflected both strategic calculation about the importance of Korean submission for regional stability and personal political considerations about the benefits of military success for imperial authority. The Empress's support for continued military action helped overcome opposition from officials who worried about the campaign's enormous expense and uncertain prospects for success. The siege of Pyongyang, Goguryeu's capital, became the focal point of Chinese efforts to complete the Korean conquest. The city's formidable fortifications, supplied by the Taedong River and defended by experienced Korean troops, presented extraordinary challenges for attacking forces. Chinese siege techniques, developed through centuries of warfare against fortified cities, included massive catapults, siege towers, and coordinated infantry assaults designed to overwhelm defensive positions. However, Pyongyang's defenders proved resourceful in countering these tactics, using fire arrows, sorties against siege equipment, and psychological warfare to maintain morale during extended siege conditions. The successful capture of Pyongyang in 676 AD marked the culmination of 15 years of intermittent warfare and represented the high point of Tang territorial expansion. The victory required coordinating land and naval forces across hundreds of miles, maintaining supply lines through hostile territory, and overcoming some of the most sophisticated fortifications in East Asia. The fall of the Goguryeo capital effectively ended organized Korean resistance to Chinese expansion and established Tang authority over the entire Korean peninsula, though subsequent rebellions and the rise of Silla as a unified Korean kingdom would later challenge this achievement. The administrative integration of Korean territories into the Tang Empire required developing new governmental structures adapted to Korean conditions and traditions. Chinese officials established the Andong Protectorate with its headquarters at Pyongyang, creating a military governorship responsible for maintaining order and collecting taxes throughout the former Goguryeo territories. The protectorate system allowed for more flexible administration than direct provincial control, accommodating local customs while ensuring Chinese political authority and military dominance. During these years of military expansion, Wu Zhao systematically eliminated potential rivals and consolidated her control over the imperial court. The Empress's methods included accusations of treason against officials who opposed her policies, strategic marriages that created networks of loyal supporters, and careful cultivation of relationships with military commanders whose loyalty ensured her physical security. Her most dramatic action involved the execution or exile of several members of the Li imperial family, including Gaozong's sons from previous marriages, whom she viewed as potential threats to her own children's succession prospects. The Empress's religious policies during this period reflected both personal conviction and political calculation about Buddhism's potential to support her authority. Wu Zhao became a generous patron of Buddhist temples and monasteries, commissioning elaborate construction projects and supporting scholarly activities that enhanced Buddhism's prestige within Chinese society. The Longmen grottos near Luoyang, featuring massive stone sculptures of Buddhist figures, represented the most spectacular examples of imperial patronage during this period. These monuments served both religious and political purposes, demonstrating imperial piety while creating lasting symbols of Wu Zhao's power and cultural sophistication. The Empress's promotion of Buddhism also involved supporting the translation of Sanskrit texts into Chinese, facilitating the work of foreign monks who brought new philosophical traditions from India and Central Asia. These scholarly activities contributed to the development of distinctively Chinese forms of Buddhism that synthesized Indian religious concepts with traditional Chinese philosophical traditions. The imperial court's support for such intellectual endeavours attracted scholars from throughout Asia and enhanced the Tang capital's reputation as a centre of learning and cultural achievement. By 683 AD, when Emperor Gaozong died after a prolonged illness, Wu Jiao had effectively controlled imperial policy for over 2 decades. The emperor's death created a succession crisis as the empress manoeuvred to maintain her authority, while managing the competing claims of her sons and other potential claimants to the throne. Her immediate installation of her son Li Jie as Emperor Zhongzong represented an attempt to preserve the appearance of legitimate succession while retaining real power in her own hands. However, the new emperor's attempts to assert independent authority quickly brought him into conflict with his formidable mother, setting the stage for the most extraordinary chapter in Chinese imperial history. The dramatic events following Emperor Gaozong's death in 683 AD thrust the Tang Dynasty into a period of unprecedented political upheaval as Wu Qiao's ambitions collided with traditional expectations of imperial succession. Her son Li Jie, enthroned as Emperor Zhongzong, possessed neither the political acumen nor the institutional support necessary to challenge his mother's dominance over court affairs. Within months of his accession, tensions between mother and son reached a breaking point when Zhongzong attempted to appoint his wife's father to a high ministerial position without consulting Wu Jiao. This seemingly minor personnel decision triggered a constitutional crisis that revealed the fundamental instability of the succession arrangement. Wu Jiao's response demonstrated the ruthless efficiency that had characterized her rise to power. In February 684 AD, she orchestrated Zhongzong's deposition on grounds of incompetence and filial disobedience, replacing him with his younger brother Li Dan, who became Emperor Ruizong. The new emperor, acutely aware of his predecessor's fate, accepted a purely ceremonial role, while Wu Jiao assumed the title of regent and exercised all meaningful imperial authority. This arrangement satisfied the formal requirements of legitimate succession, while ensuring that real power remained concentrated in Wu Jiao's hands. The regency period witnessed Wu Jiao's systematic elimination of potential opposition through a combination of political purges, strategic appointments, and the creation of new institutions loyal to her personally rather than to traditional imperial structures. She established a network of secret police agents who monitored court officials for signs of disloyalty, while simultaneously promoting capable administrators whose careers depended entirely on her continued favour. These policies created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear among the bureaucratic class, but they also ensured that governmental functions continued operating efficiently despite the constitutional irregularities surrounding Wu Jiao's authority. In 690 AD, Wu Jiao took the unprecedented step of formally deposing Emperor Ruizong and declaring herself emperor of a new dynasty, the Zhou, taking the reign name Wu Zetian. This action violated every precedent in Chinese political history, as no woman had previously claimed the imperial title or attempted to establish her own dynastic line. The Empress Dowager's transformation into Emperor Wu required extensive ideological justification, including the circulation of prophecies predicting the rise of a female ruler and the promotion of Buddhist texts that portrayed feminine authority as cosmically ordained. The establishment of the Zhou dynasty represented more than mere personal ambition. It reflected Wu Zetian's recognition that her authority could never be secure, while she remained dependent on the legitimacy of the Li family. By creating her own dynasty, she sought to establish an independent power base that would ensure her children's succession while breaking the connection to the Tang imperial line. The new dynasty's capital remained at Luoyang, which Wu Zetian had favoured over Chang'an due to its central location and her personal associations with the city. Wu Zetian's reign as emperor lasted 15 years, during which she implemented significant administrative reforms while maintaining the territorial integrity and military effectiveness that had characterized the Tang at its height. Her governmental innovations included the expansion of the imperial examination system to recruit officials based on merit rather than family connections, the creation of new administrative positions that provided opportunities for capable individuals from non-aristocratic backgrounds, and the establishment of a more centralized decision-making process that reduced the influence of established court factions. The examination system's expansion under Wu Zetian represented a particularly significant development in Chinese governmental practice. The emperor increased the frequency of examinations, broadened the range of subjects tested, and created additional pathways for advancement that accommodated different types of scholarly expertise. These reforms attracted thousands of candidates from throughout the empire, creating a larger pool of qualified officials while reducing the government's dependence on traditional aristocratic families. The system's emphasis on literary accomplishment and administrative competence aligned with Wu Zetian's preference for officials whose loyalty derived from personal advancement rather than hereditary privilege. Military affairs during Wu Zetian's reign reflected both continuity with previous Tang policies and adaptations necessary to address new challenges along the empire's extended frontiers. The emperor maintained the fubing system while adjusting its implementation to accommodate changing demographic and economic conditions. Population growth in core agricultural regions provided larger recruitment pools, while territorial expansion created new opportunities for military colonization in frontier areas. These developments allowed for the establishment of additional military agricultural settlements that strengthened border defences while contributing to economic development. The Turkic peoples of Central Asia continued to present complex challenges that required both military pressure and diplomatic accommodation. Wu Zetian's approach to Turkic relations emphasized the cultivation of client relationships with tribal leaders who could maintain order within their territories while acknowledging Chinese suzerainty. This policy required careful balance between supporting favored leaders and preventing any single tribal confederation from becoming powerful enough to challenge Chinese interests. The emperor's success in managing these relationships contributed to the relative stability of the western frontiers during her reign. The Korean situation during Wu Zetian's reign illustrated the limitations of Chinese territorial expansion and the challenges of maintaining control over distant conquests. The rise of Silla as the dominant Korean kingdom, accomplished through a combination of military success and diplomatic maneuvering, effectively ended Chinese hopes of direct control over the Korean peninsula. Rather than commit enormous resources to reasserting Tang authority, Wu Zetian accepted a tributary relationship with Silla that preserved Chinese prestige while acknowledging Korean autonomy in internal affairs. Religious policies under Wu Zetian continued to favour Buddhism while maintaining traditional Chinese religious practices and Confucian administrative principles. The emperor's Buddhist patronage included the construction of magnificent temples, the support of scholarly translation projects, and the promotion of Buddhist festivals that enhanced the religion's popular appeal. The Longmen Grottoes project reached its peak during this period, with the completion of massive stone sculptures that demonstrated both artistic achievement and imperial power. These monuments served as permanent symbols of Wu Zetian's reign, while contributing to Buddhism's integration into Chinese cultural traditions. The economic prosperity that characterized Wu Zetian's reign reflected both the accumulated benefits of previous Tang policies and new initiatives designed to enhance agricultural productivity and commercial development. The equal field system continued functioning effectively in most regions, providing stable agricultural production while generating tax revenues necessary for governmental operations. Urban centres throughout the empire experienced significant growth as improved transportation networks facilitated trade and manufacturing activities. The Grand Canal system, inherited from the Sui dynasty, proved essential for moving agricultural surpluses from productive southern regions to support population centres and military garrisons in the north. Manufacturing industries during this period benefited from technological innovations and expanded market access created by territorial expansion and diplomatic relationships. Chinese artisans developed improved techniques for producing silk, ceramics, and metalwork that found eager markets throughout Asia. The Silk Road trade networks, secured by Tang military control over Central Asian territories, provided access to luxury goods and raw materials that enhanced both imperial revenues and popular prosperity. These commercial relationships also facilitated cultural exchange that enriched Chinese artistic and intellectual traditions. Wu Zetian's later years witnessed growing concerns about succession and the long-term stability of her Zhou dynasty. The emperor's advancing age, combined with the absence of obvious successors capable of maintaining her political system, created uncertainty about the future direction of Chinese governance. Her sons, who had been marginalized during her rise to power, lacked both the experience and the institutional support necessary to continue their mother's policies effectively. Meanwhile, members of the Li family, though excluded from power, retained connections to military commanders and court officials who might support a Tang restoration under favorable circumstances. The emperor's health began declining noticeably after 700 AD, creating opportunities for various court factions to position themselves for the eventual succession struggle. Conservative officials who had reluctantly accepted Wu Zetian's authority, while hoping for an eventual return to traditional practices, began organizing support for a Tang restoration. Military commanders, whose loyalty had been essential to Wu Zetian's success, evaluated their options in light of changing political circumstances and their own career interests. The palace environment became increasingly tense as different groups maneuvered for advantage while maintaining the appearance of continued loyalty to the aging emperor. The conspiracy that ultimately led to Wu Zetian's downfall emerged from a coalition of court officials, military officers, and imperial family members who shared concerns about the Zhou dynasty's long-term viability. The plot's leaders included Zhang Jianji and other experienced administrators who had served under Wu Zetian, but concluded that her death would likely trigger a succession crisis that could destabilize the entire empire. Their solution involved forcing the emperor's abdication in favor of her son Li Jie, the former emperor Zhongzong, whose restoration would provide constitutional legitimacy while allowing the conspirators to exercise real authority. The coup attempt unfolded in February 705 AD, when the conspirators gained access to Wu Zetian's private quarters in the Luoyang Palace. The emperor, weakened by illness and surprised by the coordinated nature of the plot, offered little resistance to demands for her abdication. Her acceptance of the inevitable reflected both physical exhaustion and recognition that continued resistance would likely result in civil war that could destroy the governmental system she had spent decades creating. The conspirators' success depended on their ability to present the abdication as a voluntary decision made in the empire's best interests, rather than a forced removal that might delegitimize the subsequent restoration. Li Jie's restoration as Emperor Zhongzong in 705 AD marked the formal end of Wu Zetian's Zhou dynasty and the return of the Li family to the imperial throne. However, the restored emperor faced enormous challenges in re-establishing Tang authority, while managing the competing interests of various groups that had supported the restoration. The 21-year interruption of Tang rule had created new power centres and altered traditional relationships between the imperial family, the bureaucracy, and military commanders. Zhongzong's task involved not merely resuming previous policies, but reconstructing a governmental system capable of addressing changed circumstances. The restored emperor's reign proved brief and troubled, lasting only 5 years until his death in 710 AD under circumstances that suggested possible poisoning by his wife, Empress Wei. Zhongzong's inability to establish effective control over court politics reflected both his personal limitations and the structural problems created by the extended period of irregular succession. His attempts to reward supporters of the Restoration while accommodating former Zhou officials created confusion about governmental priorities and policy directions. The emperor's reliance on his wife's family for political support alienated military commanders and court officials who had expected greater influence following their role in the Restoration. Emperor Ruzong's second reign, beginning after Zhongzong's death, represented another attempt to stabilize Tang governance while addressing the succession question that had plagued the dynasty for decades. Ruzong, who had previously served as a puppet emperor under Wu Zetian, possessed greater awareness of court politics and the challenges facing imperial authority. However, his advanced age and the presence of multiple potential successors created new uncertainties about the dynasty's future direction. The emperor's decision to abdicate in 712 AD in favour of his son Li Longji reflected recognition that effective governance required a younger, more energetic ruler capable of implementing comprehensive reforms. Li Longji's accession as Emperor Xuanzong marked the beginning of the most celebrated period in Tang history. The new emperor, 38 years old at the time of his coronation, possessed both the political experience and personal capabilities necessary to restore the dynasty's former glory. His education had included extensive study of classical literature, military strategy, and administrative practice, while his involvement in court politics during the Restoration period had provided practical knowledge of governmental operations. Xuanzong's personality combined intellectual curiosity with decisive leadership, creating the foundation for reforms that would transform the Tang Empire. The new emperor's immediate priorities included consolidating his authority, eliminating remaining sources of political instability, and implementing reforms designed to enhance governmental efficiency and economic prosperity. Xuanzong's approach to these challenges reflected lessons learned from the previous decades of political turmoil, particularly the importance of maintaining clear lines of authority and preventing the emergence of alternative power centres that could challenge imperial control. His early actions demonstrated both respect for established traditions and willingness to modify existing practices when circumstances required adaptation. The Kaiyuan era, formally proclaimed in 713 AD, represented Xuanzong's vision for a restored and revitalized Tang Dynasty that would surpass even the achievements of Taizong's reign. The era name, meaning opening of the epoch, signalled the emperor's intention to inaugurate a new period of Chinese greatness, characterized by territorial expansion, cultural flowering, and economic prosperity. This ambitious program required comprehensive reforms affecting every aspect of imperial governance, from military organization and administrative procedures to educational policies and religious practices. Administrative efficiency improvements under Xuanzong began with a thorough reorganization of the 3 chancelleries and 6 ministries system that had been disrupted during the previous decades of political instability. The emperor appointed capable officials to key positions while establishing new procedures designed to improve communication between different governmental departments. Regular meetings between ministry heads and chancellery officials ensured coordination of policy implementation, while standardized reporting requirements provided the emperor with accurate information about conditions throughout the empire. The expansion of the imperial examination system during Xuanzong's early reign reflected both practical needs for qualified officials and philosophical commitment to meritocratic governance. The emperor increased the number of examination candidates accepted each year while creating additional specialized examinations for different types of governmental service. These reforms attracted talented individuals from throughout the empire, creating a larger pool of qualified administrators while reducing the influence of hereditary privilege in official appointments. The examination system's emphasis on classical learning and practical skills aligned with Xuanzong's vision of professional governance based on competence rather than family connections. Military reorganization under Xuanzong addressed structural problems that had developed during the previous decades, while adapting Tang forces to new strategic challenges. The emperor modified the fubing system to accommodate demographic changes and territorial requirements, creating more flexible arrangements for military service that could respond to varying local conditions. Professional military units stationed along frontier regions received improved equipment and training, while garrison forces in interior provinces focused on maintaining order and supporting civil administration. The Jidushi system, which would later become crucial to Tang military organization, began developing during Xuanzong's early reign as a response to the challenges of governing distant territories with diverse populations and strategic requirements. These military governors received broad authority over specific regions, allowing them to coordinate military and civilian activities while maintaining loyalty to the imperial centre. The system's effectiveness depended on careful selection of governors and regular rotation of assignments to prevent the development of independent power bases. Economic prosperity during the early Kai-Yuan era reflected both the recovery from previous political disruptions and new policies designed to enhance agricultural productivity and commercial development. The equal field system continued operating effectively in most regions, though demographic growth and territorial expansion required modifications to accommodate changing conditions. Agricultural improvements included the introduction of new crops, the development of improved irrigation techniques, and the establishment of agricultural colonies in previously uncultivated areas. Population growth during this period reached unprecedented levels, with imperial records indicating approximately 9 million registered households by 720 AD. This demographic expansion reflected both improved living conditions and more effective governmental administration that could maintain order while providing basic services. Urban centres throughout the empire experienced significant growth as improved transportation networks and expanded commercial opportunities attracted migrants from rural areas. Chang'an, restored as the primary imperial capital, became the world's largest city with a population exceeding 1 million residents. The flourishing of urban centres during Xuanzong's early reign created new opportunities for commercial and cultural development that enhanced the empire's prosperity and international prestige. Markets in major cities offered goods from throughout Asia, while specialised workshops produced luxury items that found eager customers both domestically and abroad. The capital's cosmopolitan character attracted merchants, scholars, and artisans from distant regions, creating a cultural environment that fostered innovation and artistic achievement. Manufacturing industries benefited from technological innovations and expanded market access created by political stability and territorial expansion. Chinese artisans developed new techniques for producing silk, ceramics, and metalwork that enhanced both quality and efficiency. The Silk Road trade networks, secured by Tang military control over Central Asian territories, provided access to raw materials and luxury goods that supported both imperial revenues and popular prosperity. These commercial relationships also facilitated cultural exchange that enriched Chinese artistic and intellectual traditions, while spreading Tang influence throughout Asia. The transformation of Chang'an into the world's most magnificent metropolis during Xuanzong's reign represented far more than urban planning success. It embodied the Tang Dynasty's emergence as the dominant civilization of its age. By 725 AD, the capital's population had swelled to approximately 1.2 million residents within the city walls, with another 800,000 inhabiting the surrounding metropolitan area. The city's rectangular layout, measuring roughly 9 kilometres east to west and 8 kilometres north to south, encompassed 84 square kilometres of carefully planned districts that accommodated this massive population while maintaining order and facilitating commerce. The Imperial Palace complex occupied the northern section of the city, its vermilion walls and golden-roofed halls rising above the urban landscape like a terrestrial representation of celestial authority. The Daming Palace, completed during this period, covered over 3 square kilometres and contained more than 40 separate buildings, connected by covered walkways and surrounded by elaborate gardens. The throne hall's soaring roof, supported by massive wooden columns and decorated with intricate carvings of dragons and phoenixes, could accommodate thousands of officials during major court ceremonies. Foreign ambassadors consistently recorded their amazement at the palace's scale and magnificence, which exceeded anything in their own capitals. The city's commercial districts pulsed with activity from dawn until the evening curfew, when bronze bells signalled the closing of market gates and the beginning of nighttime restrictions on movement. The West Market, covering approximately 1 square kilometre, housed over 3,000 shops organised into specialised sections for different types of merchandise. Silk merchants displayed bolts of fabric in colours ranging from deep imperial yellow to subtle jade green. Their stalls arranged alongside those selling precious metals, carved jade ornaments, and exotic spices imported from Southeast Asia and India. The East Market specialised in everyday goods, foodstuffs and services required by the capital's diverse population, including restaurants serving regional cuisines from throughout the empire. Foreign merchants constituted a substantial portion of Chang'an's commercial community, their presence transforming the capital into a truly international centre. Persian traders, identifiable by their distinctive pointed caps and long robes, established permanent residences in designated quarters, while maintaining commercial networks stretching from Samarkand to the Mediterranean. Arab merchants, following trade routes that connected the Tang Empire with the expanding Abbasid Caliphate, brought precious stones, perfumes and exotic textiles that commanded premium prices among wealthy Chinese consumers. Korean and Japanese envoys maintained diplomatic compounds that also served as centres for cultural and commercial exchange. The cosmopolitan character of Chang'an extended beyond mere commercial diversity to encompass religious plurality that would have been unthinkable in most contemporary civilizations. Buddhist temples, ranging from modest neighbourhood shrines to massive monastic complexes, served communities of monks and lay believers who practiced various schools of Buddhism imported from India and Central Asia. The Great Wild Goose Pagoda, standing 64 metres tall with its distinctive 7-storey brick construction, housed thousands of Sanskrit texts and served as a centre for translation activities that made Buddhist literature accessible to Chinese readers. Taoist temples provided spaces for practitioners of China's indigenous religious tradition, their courtyards filled with the smoke of incense offerings and the quiet chanting of priests performing daily rituals. The Taoist emphasis on harmony with natural forces attracted followers who sought spiritual guidance while maintaining their involvement in worldly affairs. Confucian academies, though not strictly religious institutions, served similar functions for scholars and officials who viewed moral cultivation and social responsibility as essential aspects of proper living. The presence of foreign religious communities added another dimension to Chang'an's spiritual landscape. Nestorian Christians, followers of a theological tradition that had spread eastward from Syria and Persia, maintained churches that served both foreign merchants and Chinese converts. The Nestorian stela, erected in 781 AD but reflecting earlier missionary activities, recorded the arrival of Christian teachings during Taizong's reign and their subsequent acceptance by Chinese believers. Zoroastrian fire temples provided worship spaces for Persian merchants and diplomats, while Manichaean communities practiced their dualistic faith despite occasional governmental suspicion about foreign religious influences. This religious tolerance reflected Emperor Xuanzong's sophisticated understanding of imperial governance in a diverse society. The emperor recognised that attempting to impose religious uniformity would alienate important constituencies while potentially disrupting the commercial and diplomatic relationships that contributed to Tang prosperity. His approach emphasised maintaining public order and loyalty to imperial authority, while allowing communities to practice their ancestral faiths within reasonable bounds. This policy attracted praise from foreign observers and contributed to Chang'an's reputation as a centre of civilization, where different traditions could coexist peacefully. The cultural flowering that accompanied this urban prosperity produced artistic and literary achievements that defined Chinese civilization for subsequent centuries. Poetry, already elevated to high artistic status during earlier Tang reigns, reached unprecedented heights of sophistication and emotional depth through the works of Li Bai and Du Fu, two masters whose contrasting styles encompassed the full range of human experience and artistic possibility. Li Bai, born in 701 AD in the western regions of the empire, embodied the romantic and individualistic spirit that characterized Tang culture at its peak. His poetry celebrated personal freedom, natural beauty, and the transcendent power of imagination to overcome mundane limitations. Li Bai's verse displayed technical mastery of traditional Chinese poetic forms while infusing them with spontaneous energy and emotional directness that appealed to readers across social boundaries. His famous poem Quiet Night Thoughts captured the universal experience of homesickness with deceptive simplicity, while longer works like The Road to Shu is Hard demonstrated his ability to blend landscape description with philosophical reflection. The poet's lifestyle matched the unconventional spirit of his verse. Li Bai travelled extensively throughout the empire, supporting himself through the patronage of wealthy admirers while maintaining independence from official responsibilities that might constrain his artistic freedom. His reputation for heavy drinking and eccentric behaviour became legendary, contributing to his image as a figure who transcended ordinary social conventions through the power of poetic genius. Court records indicate that Xuanzong himself admired Li Bai's work and invited the poet to serve at the Imperial Academy, though their relationship proved too volatile for sustained collaboration. Du Fu, born in 712 AD into a family with a tradition of government service, represented a different approach to poetic art that emphasized social responsibility and moral engagement with contemporary problems. His poetry combined technical excellence with deep concern for the welfare of common people, particularly during periods of political upheaval and military conflict. Du Fu's verse demonstrated mastery of traditional forms while addressing subjects that previous poets had often ignored, including the sufferings of war, the corruption of officials, and the hardships faced by farmers and soldiers. The contrast between Li Bai's romantic individualism and Du Fu's social consciousness reflected broader tensions within Tang society between personal fulfillment and collective responsibility. Both poets achieved recognition during their lifetimes, though Du Fu's reputation grew significantly after his death as later generations appreciated his moral seriousness and technical innovation. Their combined influence established poetry as the supreme literary art form in Chinese culture, while providing models for subsequent poets who sought to balance aesthetic achievement with meaningful engagement with their times. Painting during the Kaiyuan and Tianbao eras achieved new levels of sophistication through the development of techniques that captured both natural beauty and spiritual significance. Court painters like Wu Daozi perfected methods for depicting human figures with unprecedented realism while maintaining the symbolic and decorative functions that Chinese art traditionally served. Wu Daozi's murals in Buddhist temples combined religious iconography with landscape elements that created immersive environments for worship and contemplation. His technique of using flowing brushstrokes to suggest movement and emotion influenced generations of subsequent artists. Landscape painting emerged as a distinct genre during this period, reflecting Chinese philosophical traditions that emphasized harmony between human beings and natural environments. Artists developed techniques for representing mountains, rivers, and forests that conveyed both physical appearance and spiritual essence, creating works that served as objects of contemplation rather than mere decoration. The use of perspective and atmospheric effects allowed painters to suggest vast distances and changing weather conditions, while careful attention to seasonal details provided viewers with sensory experiences that complemented the visual impact. Portrait painting reached new heights of psychological insight as artists learned to capture not only physical appearance but also personality traits and emotional states. Imperial portraits served ceremonial functions while demonstrating the technical skills that made Tang artists famous throughout Asia. Court ladies, officials, and foreign dignitaries appeared in paintings that recorded their clothing, hairstyles, and accessories with meticulous accuracy, providing modern historians with valuable information about Tang material culture and social customs. Sculpture during this period combined traditional Chinese techniques with influences absorbed from Central Asian and Indian artistic traditions. Buddhist sculpture in particular benefited from this cultural synthesis, as Chinese artisans incorporated Indian iconographic conventions while developing distinctively Chinese approaches to representing spiritual themes. The sculptures at the Longmen Grottos, completed during Wu Zetian's reign but reflecting artistic traditions that flourished under Xuanzong, demonstrated the monumental scale and technical sophistication that characterized Tang sculptural achievement. Ceramic arts experienced revolutionary developments through the perfection of porcelain production techniques that created objects of unprecedented beauty and durability. Tang potters developed glazing methods that produced brilliant colours and lustrous surfaces, while their mastery of firing temperatures allowed for the creation of extremely thin-walled vessels that combined delicacy with strength. The famous Tang Sankai ceramics, decorated with green, brown and cream glazes, became prized throughout Asia and beyond, establishing Chinese ceramics as luxury goods in international markets. Music and dance at the Tang court incorporated influences from throughout the empire and beyond, creating performances that reflected the dynasty's cosmopolitan character. Court musicians played instruments imported from Central Asia, including the pipa lute and various types of drums and cymbals, while maintaining traditional Chinese instruments like the chin zither and bamboo flutes. The combination of different musical traditions produced new compositions that appealed to diverse audiences while serving ceremonial functions at court events. Dance performances at imperial celebrations featured elaborate costumes and choreography that told stories drawn from Buddhist literature, Confucian classics, and popular folklore. The famous rainbow skirt and feather coat dance, reportedly created for Xuanzong's beloved consort Yang Guifei, combined graceful movements with spectacular costumes that created visual effects suggesting supernatural transformation. These performances required extensive training and coordination among dozens of dancers, musicians and costume specialists, demonstrating the resources that the Tang court could devote to artistic achievement. The territorial expansion that accompanied this cultural flowering extended Tang influence to its greatest geographical extent in history. The empire's borders stretched from the Korean peninsula in the east to the Pamir Mountains in the west, encompassing territories that included modern-day China, Korea, Vietnam, and much of Central Asia. This vast domain required sophisticated administrative systems and military organizations capable of maintaining order across diverse populations and challenging geographical conditions. The protectorate system developed during this period provided a flexible framework for governing distant territories while accommodating local traditions and power structures. The Yangtze Protectorate, headquartered at Kucha in the Tarim Basin, administered Chinese interests in Central Asia through a combination of military garrisons, diplomatic agreements, and commercial arrangements with local rulers. Chinese officials worked with established elites to maintain order and collect taxes, while avoiding the costs and complications of direct administration over populations with different languages, customs, and religious practices. The Beiting Protectorate, centered at Tingzhou near modern-day Jimsa, controlled the northern routes of the Silk Road and managed relationships with Turkic tribes that could either support or threaten Chinese interests depending on their treatment by imperial authorities. The Protectorate's military forces included both Chinese troops and allied contingents drawn from local populations, creating integrated armies capable of responding to various types of threats while maintaining loyalty to the Tang Dynasty. Diplomatic relationships during this period extended Chinese influence far beyond the empire's direct territorial control. The Tang court maintained regular communication with the Abbasid Caliphate, the Byzantine Empire, and various Central Asian kingdoms through embassy exchanges that combined political negotiation with commercial and cultural activities. Chinese diplomatic missions travelled as far as Samarkand, Baghdad and Constantinople, carrying gifts that demonstrated Tang wealth and sophistication, while gathering information about foreign political developments and military capabilities. The Korean kingdoms maintained complex relationships with the Tang Empire that combined formal submission with practical autonomy in internal affairs. Silla, which had unified most of the Korean peninsula by the late 7th century, acknowledged Chinese suzerainty while maintaining its own governmental institutions and military forces. Regular tribute missions from the Korean court to Chang'an provided opportunities for diplomatic consultation and cultural exchange, while Korean students and monks travelled to China to study at imperial academies and Buddhist monasteries. Japanese diplomatic missions, known as kentoshi, brought delegations of scholars, monks and officials to the Tang capital for extended periods of study and observation. These missions, which occurred approximately every 20 years, transferred Chinese governmental practices, religious traditions and cultural innovations to Japan, where they were adapted to local conditions and integrated into Japanese civilization. The scale and frequency of these exchanges demonstrated the Tang Empire's role as the dominant cultural influence in East Asia during this period. The economic foundation supporting this territorial expansion and cultural achievement rested on agricultural productivity that reached unprecedented levels during the Kaiyuan era. The equal field system continued providing stable land tenure for millions of farming families while generating tax revenues necessary for governmental operations and military campaigns. Agricultural improvements included the introduction of new crop varieties, the development of improved irrigation techniques, and the establishment of agricultural colonies in previously uncultivated regions. Rice cultivation in the Yangtze River Valley achieved remarkable productivity through the development of new varieties and cultivation techniques that allowed for multiple harvests per year in favourable conditions. The introduction of champa rice from Vietnam provided a drought-resistant variety that could be grown in areas previously unsuitable for rice cultivation, expanding the total agricultural area while improving food security for the empire's growing population. Wheat production in northern regions benefited from improved ploughing techniques and the use of iron agricultural tools that increased efficiency while reducing labour requirements. Commercial agriculture developed alongside subsistence farming as improved transportation networks created markets for specialised crops and manufactured goods. Tea cultivation expanded significantly during this period, transforming a regional beverage into a commodity with empire-wide distribution. Silk production, already well established in Chinese agriculture, achieved new levels of quality and quantity through improved breeding techniques and processing methods that enhanced both the appearance and durability of finished products. The Grand Canal system, inherited from the Sui dynasty but expanded and improved under Tang administration, provided essential transportation infrastructure that connected agricultural regions with urban centres and military garrisons. The canal's northern section, linking the Yangtze River Valley with the Yellow River Basin, allowed for the efficient movement of grain shipments that fed the capital and supported military operations along the northern frontiers. Regular maintenance and improvement of canal facilities required substantial governmental investment, but provided economic returns that justified these expenditures. The prosperity and cultural magnificence of the Kaiyuan era began showing cracks by the 740s as Emperor Xuanzong's attention gradually shifted from governance to personal pleasures, particularly his infatuation with Yang Guifei, a consort whose beauty and charm captivated the aging emperor. Born Yang Yuhuan in 719 AD, she had originally been married to Xuanzong's 18th son, Prince Shou, before catching the emperor's eye during a court gathering in 737 AD. The emperor's decision to bring her into his own harem violated traditional protocols and created scandal among court officials, but Xuanzong's passion overrode such concerns. By 745 AD, Yang Guifei had been formally elevated to the rank of imperial consort, wielding influence over imperial policy that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of harem politics. The emperor's obsession with Yang Guifei coincided with a gradual deterioration in his attention to administrative details and military affairs. Court sessions became less frequent, as Xuanzong preferred to spend time in the imperial gardens, composing poetry and music for his beloved consort. The emperor's famous composition, Rainbow Skirt and Feather Coat, required elaborate performances involving hundreds of dancers and musicians, consuming enormous resources while demonstrating the ruler's shift from practical governance to aesthetic pursuits. Officials noticed that memorials requiring imperial attention often went unread for weeks, while routine administrative decisions were increasingly delegated to Yang Guifei's relatives and supporters. Yang Guifei's family, particularly her cousin Yang Guozhong, rapidly accumulated power and wealth through their connection to the imperial favourite. Yang Guozhong, appointed to high ministerial positions despite limited administrative experience, used his influence to place family members and allies in key governmental posts throughout the empire. This nepotistic network created resentment among career officials who saw their own advancement blocked by less qualified individuals whose primary credential was family connection to the imperial consort. The Yang family's ostentatious displays of wealth, including elaborate mansions and expensive entertainments, became symbols of governmental corruption and imperial favoritism. The military implications of Xuanzong's neglect became apparent in the gradual weakening of the fubing system that had provided the foundation for Tang military success. The system of military agricultural colonies, which had functioned effectively for over a century, began experiencing recruitment difficulties as population growth and economic opportunities in civilian occupations made military service less attractive. Many fubing units fell below their authorised strength levels, while equipment maintenance and training standards declined due to inadequate supervision and funding. The emperor's focus on court entertainments meant that these problems received insufficient attention until they had become serious threats to imperial security. Simultaneously, the empire's vast territorial extent created administrative challenges that strained even the sophisticated Tang governmental system. The protectorates governing Central Asian territories required constant attention to maintain loyalty among diverse populations and prevent the emergence of local independence movements. Communication delays across thousands of miles meant that crises could develop for months before reaching the emperor's attention, while the expense of maintaining garrisons and administrative personnel in remote regions consumed increasing portions of imperial revenues. The Jidushi system, originally designed to provide flexible military governance for frontier regions, began evolving into semi-autonomous power centres as regional commanders accumulated authority necessary to address local challenges without waiting for instructions from Chang'an. And Lushan emerged from this context as perhaps the most successful of the frontier military governors, commanding the Fanyang, Pinglu and Hedong military regions that controlled strategic territories along the empire's northeastern borders. Born around 703 AD to a Sogdian father and Turkic mother in the frontier region near modern-day Beijing, and Lushan represented the cosmopolitan character of Tang civilization while embodying the military traditions that had made the dynasty successful. His mixed ethnic heritage, common among frontier populations, provided him with linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge that proved invaluable in managing relationships between Chinese administrators and non-Chinese military personnel. And Lushan's rise through the military hierarchy demonstrated both exceptional ability and careful political calculation. His early career involved service in campaigns against Khitan and Xi tribal confederations that threatened Chinese settlements along the northeastern frontier, and Lushan's tactical skills, combined with his ability to inspire loyalty among diverse military units, brought him to the attention of senior commanders who recommended him for promotion. By 742 AD, he had been appointed military governor of Fanyang, controlling approximately 150,000 troops and governing territories that stretched from the Great Wall to the Bohai Sea. The military forces under An Lushan's command represented some of the Tang Empire's most effective fighting units, hardened by constant warfare against nomadic raiders and experienced in the mobile tactics necessary for frontier defence. His armies included significant contingents of non-Chinese soldiers, particularly Khitan and Turkic cavalry units whose fighting skills exceeded those of traditional Chinese infantry formations. These troops maintained personal loyalty to An Lushan rather than abstract devotion to the Tang Dynasty, creating a power base that could potentially be used for purposes beyond legitimate military service. An Lushan's relationship with the imperial court involved careful cultivation of key figures who could advance his interests and protect him from potential rivals. His most important connection developed with Yang Guifei, whom he flattered with elaborate gifts and demonstrations of loyalty that appealed to her vanity while securing her support for his continued advancement. Court records indicate that An Lushan adopted Yang Guifei as his symbolic mother, participating in ceremonies that formalized this relationship while providing him with access to imperial audiences and protection from his enemies' accusations. The general's physical appearance contributed to his success at court, where his imposing stature and exotic features made him a memorable figure among the predominantly Chinese officials. Contemporary accounts describe An Lushan as exceptionally tall and heavy, with a commanding presence that impressed both military subordinates and court dignitaries. His ability to speak multiple languages fluently allowed him to serve as an intermediary between the imperial government and frontier populations, while his knowledge of nomadic customs made him effective in diplomatic negotiations with tribal leaders. By 750 AD, An Lushan had accumulated unprecedented authority for a regional military governor, controlling 3 major military districts while maintaining extensive commercial and political networks throughout northern China. His territories generated enormous revenues through taxation of agricultural production and control of trade routes connecting China with Central Asia and Korea. The general used these resources to maintain military forces larger than officially authorized, while developing personal relationships with subordinate commanders whose loyalty transcended their obligations to the imperial government. The warning signs of An Lushan's potential disloyalty became apparent to observant court officials during the early 750s, though Emperor Xuanzong's preoccupation with Yang Guifei prevented effective response to these concerns. Intelligence reports indicated that An Lushan was recruiting additional soldiers beyond his authorized strength levels, stockpiling weapons and supplies that exceeded normal requirements for frontier defense, and establishing communication networks that bypassed official governmental channels. His frequent absences from the capital, ostensibly for military campaigns against nomadic raiders, provided opportunities to consolidate his regional power base without imperial oversight. Yang Guozhong, Yang Guifei's cousin who had emerged as the dominant figure in imperial administration, recognized An Lushan as a potential threat to his own position and began maneuvering to reduce the general's influence. The rivalry between these 2 powerful figures reflected broader tensions within the Tang governmental system between civilian administrators and military commanders, as well as personal ambitions that transcended policy considerations. Yang Guozhong's efforts to limit An Lushan's authority included attempts to transfer some of his military units to other commands and investigations into his financial activities that might provide grounds for accusations of corruption. The confrontation between Yang Guozhong and An Lushan intensified throughout 754 and early 755 AD, as both men sought to position themselves advantageously for the eventual imperial succession. Yang Guozhong's influence with Yang Guifei provided him with access to Emperor Xuanzong, while An Lushan's military resources offered more tangible power that could be used to protect his interests or advance his ambitions. The emperor's failure to resolve this conflict decisively created an unstable situation that encouraged both parties to consider extreme measures for eliminating their rival. And Lushan's decision to rebel reflected his calculation that Yang Guozhong's growing influence threatened his survival, and that military action offered better prospects than continued political maneuvering within the existing system. The general's preparations for rebellion had been developing for several years, involving the gradual accumulation of loyal military units, the establishment of supply networks capable of supporting extended campaigns, and diplomatic contacts with potential allies who might support his cause. His mixed ethnic background provided connections with nomadic groups that could supplement his Chinese military forces, while his administrative experience in frontier regions had demonstrated the practical possibilities of governing territories independently from Chang'an. The rebellion began on December 16th, 755 AD, when An Lushan declared himself emperor of a new dynasty called Yan and began marching south from Fanyang toward the Tang capitals. His initial proclamation accused Yang Guozhong of corrupting imperial governance and claimed that his military action aimed to restore proper administration rather than overthrow the Tang dynasty itself. This rhetorical strategy reflected An Lushan's understanding that successful rebellion required ideological justification that would appeal to broader constituencies beyond his immediate military supporters. An Lushan's army, numbering approximately 200,000 troops at the rebellion's outset, represented one of the largest military forces ever assembled in Chinese history. The rebel forces included his original frontier garrisons, supplemented by additional recruits, drawn from populations that had grievances against imperial taxation or administrative policies. Khitan and Turkic cavalry units provided mobility and fighting effectiveness that exceeded the capabilities of most Tang military formations, while Chinese infantry troops contributed discipline and siege warfare expertise necessary for capturing fortified cities. The rebels' initial advance proceeded with shocking rapidity as Tang defensive forces proved inadequate to contain An Lushan's advance. The imperial government's military response revealed the extent to which the fubing system had deteriorated during Xuanzong's later years, as many units existed only on paper while others lacked the equipment and training necessary for effective combat. Regional commanders who might have coordinated resistance efforts were either sympathetic to An Lushan's cause or reluctant to commit their own forces without clear instructions from the imperial government. The capture of Luoyang on January 5th, 756 AD, provided An Lushan with control over the empire's eastern capital and access to the Grand Canal system that connected northern and southern China. The city's fall demonstrated the rebels' military effectiveness, while providing them with enormous quantities of stored grain, weapons, and other supplies necessary for continued operations. An Lushan's establishment of his court at Luoyang symbolically challenged Tang legitimacy, while providing him with the administrative infrastructure necessary for governing conquered territories. The psychological impact of Luoyang's fall on imperial morale cannot be overstated, as the city had served as a secondary capital for centuries, and its loss suggested that the rebellion posed an existential threat to Tang survival. News of the defeat reached Chang'an within days, creating panic among court officials and wealthy families who began preparing for possible evacuation. Emperor Xuanzong's initial response reflected both shock at the speed of rebel success and uncertainty about appropriate countermeasures, as the imperial military system had not faced such a comprehensive challenge since the dynasty's founding. And Lushan's advance toward Chang'an continued throughout the spring of 756 AD as Tang resistance efforts failed to slow the rebel momentum significantly. The emperor's attempts to organize defensive forces were hampered by the deteriorated state of imperial military units, and the reluctance of regional commanders to commit their troops to what appeared to be a losing cause. The rebels' success in recruiting additional supporters from populations that had suffered under heavy taxation or corrupt administration demonstrated that the rebellion had tapped into genuine grievances against imperial policies. The crisis reached its climax in June 756 AD, when An Lushan's forces approached Chang'an's outer defences, forcing Emperor Xuanzong to choose between attempting to defend the capital or evacuating to safer territory. The emperor's decision to flee westward towards Sichuan province reflected both realistic assessment of military circumstances and personal unwillingness to risk capture by rebel forces. The imperial evacuation, conducted hastily during the night of June 13th, 14, marked the effective collapse of Tang governmental authority in northern China and the beginning of the most catastrophic period in Chinese history since the fall of the Han Dynasty. The evacuation convoy's composition revealed the extent of governmental disorganization, as essential records and treasures were abandoned, while court officials and their families struggled to escape with personal possessions. The emperor's entourage included Yang Guifei and her relatives, whose presence reminded fleeing officials of the favoritism and corruption that had contributed to the current crisis. The convoy's slow progress westward, hampered by poor roads and inadequate supplies, provided opportunities for popular resentment against imperial policies to manifest in direct confrontations with the fleeing court. The most dramatic incident occurred at Mawei Station on June 15th, 756 AD, when imperial guards and local officials demanded Yang Guifei's execution as the price for their continued loyalty to the emperor. The mutinous troops blamed Yang Guifei and her family for the governmental corruption that had enabled An Lushan's rebellion, arguing that their deaths were necessary to restore imperial legitimacy and military morale. Emperor Xuanzong's agonizing decision to sacrifice his beloved consort demonstrated both the desperate nature of imperial circumstances and the extent to which popular anger had focused on the Yang family as symbols of dynastic failure. Yang Guifei's death by strangulation at Mawei Station marked the end of the romantic relationship that had dominated Xuanzong's later years, while symbolically representing the collapse of the Kaiyuan era's prosperity and cultural achievement. The emperor's grief over his consort's death, combined with his recognition that his own policies had contributed to the current catastrophe, led to his decision to abdicate in favour of his son Li Heng, who became Emperor Suzong. This abdication, formalised on August 12th, 756 AD, represented the first voluntary imperial abdication in Tang history and reflected Xuanzong's acknowledgement that new leadership was necessary to address the rebellion's challenges. An Lushan's occupation of Chang'an in July 756 AD completed the rebels' conquest of both Tang capitals and established their control over the empire's political and economic heartland. The rebel emperor's court ceremonies in the abandoned imperial palace provided symbolic legitimacy for his regime, while demonstrating the extent of Tang governmental collapse. However, An Lushan's success in capturing territory proved easier than establishing effective administration over conquered regions, as his military organisation lacked the sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus necessary for governing the complex society he had conquered. The assassination of An Lushan by his own son An Qingsu in January 757 AD failed to end the rebellion that had devastated the Tang Empire, instead fragmenting rebel forces into competing factions that prolonged the conflict for another 6 years. And Qingxu's patricide, motivated by fears that his father planned to replace him as heir with a younger half-brother, demonstrated the internal contradictions that plagued the rebel regime from its inception. The new rebel leader lacked his father's charismatic authority and military acumen, struggling to maintain unity among the diverse coalition of Sogdian merchants, Turkic cavalry commanders, and Chinese defectors who had supported the original uprising. Emperor Suzong's response to these developments revealed both the opportunity created by rebel disunity and the enormous challenges facing any attempt to restore Tang authority. The new emperor, who had established his court at Lingwu in modern-day Ningxia province, commanded limited military resources consisting primarily of frontier garrisons that had remained loyal and hastily recruited militia units of questionable effectiveness. The imperial treasury, depleted by years of extravagant court spending and the loss of tax revenues from rebel-controlled territories, could barely support existing military operations, let alone finance the massive campaigns necessary to recapture the capitals. The emperor's most crucial decision involved accepting military assistance from the Uyghur Khaganate, the Turkic confederation that had emerged as the dominant nomadic power following the collapse of the earlier Turkic empires. Moyanchur, the Uyghur Khan, commanded approximately 100,000 experienced cavalry warriors whose mobility and fighting skills far exceeded anything available to either Tang or rebel forces. The alliance negotiations, conducted through intermediaries familiar with nomadic diplomatic customs, required substantial concessions, including territorial grants, tribute payments, and commercial privileges that would burden the Tang government for decades. The Uyghur intervention proved decisive in shifting military momentum against the rebels, though at enormous cost to Chinese sovereignty and resources. The nomadic cavalry's first major engagement occurred at the Battle of Xiangji Temple in October 757 AD, where 10,000 Uyghur horsemen routed a rebel force twice their size through coordinated charges that shattered Chinese infantry formations. The Uyghurs' tactical superiority reflected their adaptation of traditional nomadic warfare techniques to Chinese battlefield conditions, utilizing composite bows with superior range and penetration, while maintaining the mobility advantages that made nomadic cavalry formidable opponents. The recapture of Chang'an in October 757 AD marked a symbolic victory for imperial restoration efforts, though the capital's condition revealed the extent of destruction caused by 2 years of warfare and occupation. Rebel forces had systematically looted imperial palaces, removing valuable artwork, furniture, and decorative materials that represented centuries of accumulated cultural treasures. The Daming Palace's throne hall stood empty, its golden dragons and phoenix carvings stripped away by rebel soldiers seeking portable wealth. Residential districts throughout the city showed evidence of fighting, with burned buildings and abandoned courtyards testifying to the civilian population's suffering during the prolonged conflict. The Uyghur allies' behaviour during and after the capital's recapture created new problems that complicated the restoration process. Nomadic warriors, accustomed to claiming spoils of war as compensation for their military service, engaged in extensive looting that affected both rebel supporters and innocent civilians. Uyghur cavalry units roamed through market districts, seizing merchandise and livestock while demanding tribute from merchants and artisans. The emperor's inability to control his allies' predatory behaviour undermined popular support for the restoration, while demonstrating the extent to which Tang authority had become dependent on foreign military assistance. The subsequent campaign to recapture Luoyang required 8 additional months of siege warfare that further depleted imperial resources while revealing the rebels' continued capacity for organised resistance. And Qingshu's forces had fortified the eastern capital with elaborate defensive works including ditches, wooden palisades, and stone barriers that channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The siege's prolonged duration allowed rebel commanders to organise relief expeditions from territories they still controlled, creating a complex military situation that required Tang forces to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The final assault on Luoyang in March 758 AD succeeded only through massive Uyghur cavalry charges that overwhelmed rebel defensive positions, though the victory's cost included the virtual destruction of the city's commercial and residential districts. Uyghur warriors, frustrated by months of siege warfare and eager to claim compensation for their efforts, engaged in systematic pillaging that reduced much of the eastern capital to ruins. Contemporary accounts describe streets littered with corpses and debris, while surviving residents fled to rural areas rather than remain in the devastated urban environment. And Qingshu's capture and execution ended the primary rebel dynasty, but remnant forces under Shi Siming continued resistance from bases in Hebei province for another 4 years. Shi Siming, a former Tang general who had defected to An Lushan's cause, possessed greater military competence than An Qingxiu and understood Chinese administrative practices sufficiently to maintain effective governance over territories under his control. His forces included experienced Chinese officers and well-disciplined infantry units that proved more resilient than the diverse coalition that had supported the original rebellion. The protracted nature of these final campaigns exhausted both imperial and rebel resources, while creating conditions for the emergence of regional military strongmen who would dominate Chinese politics for the remainder of the Tang period. Local commanders who had raised troops to fight against the rebels discovered that their military forces provided political leverage that could be used to extract concessions from the weakened imperial government. The Jidushi system, originally designed to provide flexible military administration for frontier regions, began expanding throughout the empire as the central government lacked sufficient resources to maintain direct control over distant territories. Emperor Suzong's death in May 762 AD, shortly before the rebellion's final suppression, brought his son Li Yu to the throne as Emperor Daizong. The new emperor inherited an empire that bore little resemblance to the prosperous and culturally vibrant realm that had existed before An Lushan's uprising. The imperial capitals required massive reconstruction efforts that strained government finances, while the population of formerly productive agricultural regions had been devastated by years of warfare, conscription, and economic disruption. Tax revenues had declined by an estimated 60% compared to pre-rebellion levels, forcing the government to implement emergency measures that included currency debasement, forced loans from wealthy families, and the sale of governmental positions to raise necessary funds. The demographic catastrophe accompanying the rebellion represented perhaps the most severe population decline in Chinese history, with contemporary records suggesting that the empire's registered population fell from approximately 52 million to 16 million between 755 and 764 AD. While these figures likely reflect administrative collapse rather than actual mortality rates, the scale of disruption was unprecedented. Entire counties in northern China had been depopulated through warfare, famine, and refugee movements, while urban centres that had flourished during the Kaiyuan era struggled to maintain basic services and commercial activities. Emperor Daizong's attempts to restore imperial authority faced the fundamental challenge that the rebellion had permanently altered the balance of power between the central government and regional military commanders. The Jidushi, who had supported imperial restoration efforts, expected substantial autonomy in governing their territories, including the right to appoint subordinate officials, collect taxes, and maintain military forces sized according to local rather than central government assessments. These expectations conflicted with traditional Chinese governmental principles that emphasized centralized administration and imperial control over all significant policy decisions. The emperor's compromise solution involved accepting de facto regional autonomy while maintaining the fiction of centralized control through ceremonial submissions and nominal imperial appointments. Regional military governors received formal recognition of their authority in exchange for periodic tribute payments and symbolic acknowledgement of imperial suzerainty. This arrangement allowed for the restoration of basic governmental functions, while avoiding the military confrontations that the weakened central government could not afford to undertake. The economic recovery efforts during Daizong's reign required fundamental reforms to the tax system that had supported Tang prosperity during the 7th and early 8th centuries. The equal field system, which had provided stable agricultural production through standardized land grants, had collapsed in many regions due to population displacement and the inability of local officials to maintain accurate registration records. The Fubing military service system, which had combined agricultural production with defence obligations, proved impossible to restore given the changed demographic and economic conditions throughout the empire. The implementation of the twice-a-year tax system, known as Liang Shui Fa, represented the most significant fiscal innovation of this period. This reform, developed by the financial administrator Yang Yan and implemented beginning in 780 AD during the early years of Emperor Dezong's reign, abandoned the complex land and labour service obligations that had characterised previous Tang taxation in favour of simplified monetary payments collected twice annually. The new system assessed taxes based on actual landholding and wealth, rather than theoretical equal field allocations, providing more realistic revenue estimates while reducing administrative complexity. The twice-a-year tax system's effectiveness depended on accurate assessment of agricultural productivity and commercial activity, requiring local officials to conduct detailed surveys of land use, crop yields, and household wealth. These assessments proved challenging in regions where warfare had disrupted traditional record-keeping systems and displaced substantial portions of the population. However, the system's flexibility allowed for adjustments based on local conditions, making it more adaptable to the changed circumstances of post-rebellion China than the rigid equal field framework. The salt monopoly policies implemented during this period provided another crucial source of government revenue while demonstrating the state's capacity for commercial regulation, despite its reduced territorial control. Salt production, concentrated in coastal regions and inland salt lakes, could be effectively monitored and taxed through control of transportation networks and distribution centres. The monopoly system required merchants to purchase salt at government-controlled prices before selling it to consumers, generating substantial profits that helped offset the decline in agricultural tax revenues. The administration of the salt monopoly revealed both the possibilities and limitations of Tang governmental capacity during the recovery period. Imperial officials could effectively control salt distribution in regions where they maintained military and administrative authority, but their ability to prevent smuggling and unauthorized production depended on cooperation from local military commanders who might prioritize regional interests over imperial revenue requirements. The system's success varied significantly between different parts of the empire, reflecting the fragmented nature of political authority that characterized the post-rebellion period. The continued challenge of autonomous military regions dominated political considerations throughout the reigns of Emperors Suzong, Daizong, and Dezong. The Hebei region, where Shi Siming and his successors had maintained independent authority during the final years of the Anlushan Rebellion, emerged as a persistent centre of resistance to imperial control. The military governors who inherited Shi Siming's territories established hereditary succession systems that effectively created independent kingdoms within the nominal boundaries of the Tang Empire. These autonomous regions maintained their own military forces, collected taxes for their own use, and conducted diplomatic relationships with neighbouring territories without imperial oversight. The Vibo, Chengde, and Lulong military regions in Hebei became known as the Three Garrisons that consistently refused to acknowledge central government authority while maintaining sufficient military strength to resist imperial attempts at reconquest. Their example encouraged similar assertions of independence by military commanders in other regions, creating a fragmented political landscape that persisted throughout the remainder of the Tang period. Emperor Dezong's accession in 779 AD brought to the throne a ruler determined to restore genuine imperial authority through military action against recalcitrant regional commanders. The new emperor's aggressive policies reflected both personal conviction about the necessity of centralized government and advice from officials who argued that continued accommodation of regional autonomy would eventually lead to complete imperial collapse. Dezong's early reign witnessed several military campaigns designed to reassert central control over autonomous regions, though these efforts achieved limited success while consuming resources needed for other governmental functions. The emperor's most ambitious attempt at reasserting central authority involved the campaign against Li Shili, the military governor of Huaishi, who had declared independence and begun expanding his territory at the expense of neighbouring regions loyal to the imperial government. The campaign, launched in 781 AD, required coordinating forces from multiple loyal military regions, while maintaining sufficient reserves to prevent other autonomous commanders from exploiting the central government's military commitments. The prolonged nature of the conflicts demonstrated both the resilience of regional military organisations and the limitations of imperial military capacity. The cultural and intellectual developments during this period of political fragmentation and economic recovery reflected both continuity with earlier Tang traditions and adaptations to changed circumstances. The Confucian revival movement, which gained momentum during the late 8th century, represented an intellectual response to the political and social disruptions caused by the Anlushan Rebellion. Scholars like Han Yu argued that the rebellion's devastation resulted from the abandonment of traditional Chinese values in favour of foreign influences, particularly Buddhism, that had corrupted imperial governance and social relationships. The Confucian revival emphasised the importance of moral cultivation, social hierarchy, and governmental responsibility as foundations for political stability and cultural prosperity. Han Yu's famous Memorial on Buddhism criticised the emperor's patronage of Buddhist institutions, while arguing that resources devoted to temple construction and monastic support would be better used for practical governmental functions like education, infrastructure maintenance, and military preparedness. This critique reflected broader concerns about the allocation of imperial resources during a period of fiscal constraint and political uncertainty. The emergence of new literary forms during this period demonstrated the continued vitality of Chinese cultural traditions despite political disruptions. The development of prose poetry, known as fu, provided writers with flexible formats for addressing contemporary political and social issues while maintaining connection to classical literary traditions. These works often combined personal reflection with social commentary, creating literature that spoke to the experiences of educated individuals navigating the uncertainties of post-rebellion society. The transmission of classical texts received renewed attention as scholars recognised that political instability threatened the preservation of cultural knowledge accumulated over previous centuries. The establishment of new academies and the systematic copying of important works reflected intellectual efforts to maintain cultural continuity despite the disruption of traditional educational institutions. These preservation activities contributed to the development of more systematic approaches to textual scholarship that would influence Chinese intellectual traditions for subsequent centuries. The Buddhist intellectual tradition continued developing during this period, despite criticism from Confucian revivalists, with important advances in philosophical synthesis and practical applications of Buddhist teachings. The emergence of distinctively Chinese Buddhist schools, particularly Chan Buddhism, reflected the adaptation of Indian religious concepts to Chinese cultural contexts and intellectual traditions. These developments contributed to the creation of religious and philosophical frameworks that could address the spiritual and ethical challenges posed by political instability and social change. The intellectual ferment of the late 8th century, marked by the Confucian revival and debates over resource allocation, created the ideological foundation for what would become the most systematic persecution of Buddhism in Chinese history. Emperor Wuzong's ascension to the throne in 840 AD brought to power a ruler whose personal convictions aligned with the growing criticism of Buddhist influence on imperial governance and economic policy. Unlike his predecessors who had maintained pragmatic tolerance for diverse religious traditions, Wuzong embraced Taoist practices and philosophy, while viewing Buddhism as a foreign corruption that drained imperial resources and undermined traditional Chinese social structures. The emperor's religious preferences reflected both personal inclination and political calculation about the sources of imperial weakness during the post-An Lushan period. Wuzong had observed how Buddhist monasteries accumulated vast landholdings that remained exempt from taxation, depriving the imperial government of revenues desperately needed for military operations and administrative functions. Monastic communities controlled an estimated 160,000 hectares of agricultural land by 840 AD, while temple treasuries contained enormous quantities of gold, silver, and precious objects donated by wealthy believers seeking spiritual merit through material generosity. The scale of Buddhist institutional wealth had grown particularly problematic during the decades of political fragmentation following the An Lushan rebellion, when regional military commanders often granted additional tax exemptions and land grants to monastic communities in exchange for political support or spiritual legitimacy. Some monasteries functioned as virtual banks, lending money to merchants and farmers while accumulating interest payments that further expanded their economic influence. The Qian Temple in Chang'an reportedly owned over 4,000 hectares of prime agricultural land, while the Feimen Temple possessed a collection of gold and silver vessels valued at more than 100,000 strings of cash. Wuzong's initial moves against Buddhist institutions began subtly through administrative restrictions that tested the extent of potential resistance while avoiding direct confrontation with powerful monastic leaders. Imperial edicts issued in 841 AD limited the number of monks who could be ordained each year, required existing monastics to register with local authorities, and prohibited the construction of new temples without specific imperial permission. These measures, presented as efforts to maintain proper religious standards rather than persecution, allowed the emperor to gauge reactions from Buddhist communities and their secular supporters. The emperor's Taoist advisors, particularly the alchemist Zhao Gujian, provided both ideological justification for anti-Buddhist policies and practical guidance for implementing religious reforms. Zhao's influence reflected Wuzong's personal fascination with Taoist longevity practices and alchemical experiments designed to achieve immortality through the consumption of specially prepared elixirs. The emperor's daily routine included elaborate rituals involving the ingestion of mercury-based compounds and other mineral preparations that Taoist masters claimed would purify the body and extend life indefinitely. The systematic persecution began in earnest during 843 AD with imperial orders for the closure of smaller Buddhist temples and the forced return of monks and nuns to secular life. Local officials received detailed instructions for conducting these operations, including procedures for inventorying temple properties, redistributing monastic lands to tax-paying farmers, and ensuring that former religious personnel found appropriate civilian occupations. The initial phase targeted establishments with fewer than 20 residents, avoiding direct confrontation with major monastic centres while establishing precedents for more comprehensive action. The efficiency of these early closures demonstrated the imperial government's administrative capacity despite decades of political fragmentation and economic difficulty. Provincial governors coordinated with county magistrates to conduct simultaneous operations across multiple jurisdictions, preventing Buddhist communities from transferring assets to safer locations or organising coordinated resistance. Military units provided security during temple closures, while transportation networks facilitated the rapid movement of confiscated materials to imperial storage facilities. The confiscation procedures revealed the extraordinary wealth that Buddhist institutions had accumulated during 2 centuries of imperial patronage and popular devotion. Officials conducting inventories at the Daxingshan Temple in Chang'an discovered over 3,000 bronze Buddha statues, 1,500 gold and silver vessels, and silk textiles sufficient to clothe several thousand people. The temple's library contained more than 5,000 scrolls, including rare Sanskrit manuscripts and Chinese translations that represented centuries of scholarly work. Granaries associated with the temple complex held enough rice and wheat to feed the capital's population for several months. The forced secularization of monastic personnel created significant social and economic disruption, as thousands of individuals who had spent decades in religious life attempted to reintegrate into civilian society. Many former monks and nuns lacked practical skills necessary for agricultural or commercial work, having devoted their adult lives to religious study and ritual practice. The imperial government established programs to provide basic training in farming techniques and handicraft production, though these efforts proved inadequate for addressing the scale of displacement caused by the persecution. The destruction of Buddhist art and architecture during the persecution represented one of the most devastating cultural losses in Chinese history, as imperial orders required the melting down of bronze statues and the dismantling of wooden temple structures for their valuable materials. The famous bronze Buddha statue at the Feimen Temple, standing over 10 meters tall and containing several tons of precious metal, was broken apart and transported to imperial foundries where it was recast into coins and ingots. Wooden buildings were systematically dismantled, with their timber used for governmental construction projects or sold to raise revenue for the imperial treasury. The persecution's economic impact extended far beyond the immediate confiscation of Buddhist wealth, as the sudden influx of precious metals into imperial coffers created significant monetary instability. The government's decision to mint large quantities of new coins using bronze from melted Buddha statues increased the money supply faster than economic growth could absorb, leading to inflationary pressures that affected prices throughout the empire. Merchants found their existing inventories worth less in real terms, while farmers discovered that their grain commanded lower prices relative to manufactured goods and luxury items. The redistribution of monastic lands to secular farmers initially appeared to address the imperial government's fiscal problems by bringing previously tax-exempt territories under regular assessment. However, the practical challenges of surveying and allocating these lands proved more complex than anticipated, as monastic properties often consisted of scattered plots that had been donated by different individuals over extended periods. Determining appropriate recipients for redistributed land required extensive administrative work that strained local governmental capacity while creating opportunities for corruption and favoritism. Regional military commanders responded to the Buddhist persecution with varying degrees of cooperation, reflecting their individual relationships with monastic communities and calculations about the policy's implications for their own authority. Some Jadushi enthusiastically supported the persecution as an opportunity to confiscate valuable properties within their territories, while others maintained protective relationships with Buddhist institutions that had provided political support during previous conflicts. The uneven implementation of imperial orders demonstrated the continued fragmentation of governmental authority despite Wuzong's attempts to reassert central control. The persecution's impact on international relationships proved particularly significant, given Buddhism's role as a cultural bridge connecting China with other Asian civilizations. Diplomatic missions from Buddhist kingdoms in Southeast Asia and Central Asia expressed concern about the treatment of their co-religionists, while the destruction of temples that had served as centres for international scholarly exchange disrupted cultural relationships that had flourished for centuries. The Japanese court, which maintained strong Buddhist traditions, suspended several planned embassy missions rather than witness the persecution's effects firsthand. Wuzong's death in March 846 AD, possibly caused by mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments, brought an immediate end to the systematic persecution of Buddhism, as his successor Emperor Xuanzong reversed the anti-Buddhist policies within months of his accession. The new emperor's restoration of Buddhist institutions reflected both personal religious conviction and practical recognition that the persecution had created more problems than it had solved. However, the damage to Buddhist institutional structure proved largely irreversible, as many temples remained closed and monastic communities never recovered their pre-persecution numbers or influence. The long-term consequences of the Buddhist persecution extended far beyond religious affairs to fundamentally alter the relationship between imperial authority and regional power centres. The emperor's inability to implement his policies uniformly throughout the empire demonstrated the practical limitations of central governmental control, while the varied responses of regional commanders revealed the extent to which local interests had superseded imperial directives in determining actual policy implementation. This fragmentation of authority would characterize the remainder of the Tang period as successive emperors struggled to maintain meaningful control over increasingly autonomous regional territories. The weakening of the imperial examination system during this period reflected broader changes in the relationship between central government and aristocratic families that had begun during the Anlushan Rebellion and accelerated throughout the 9th century. The examination system, which had served as the primary mechanism for recruiting officials based on merit rather than family connections, faced increasing challenges as regional military commanders gained the authority to appoint subordinates without reference to examination qualifications or imperial approval. The hereditary privilege that had characterized Chinese aristocracy before the Tang Dynasty's meritocratic reforms began reasserting itself as established families leveraged their accumulated wealth and political connections to secure governmental positions for their members. The great clans of Shandong, Henan, and other regions that had dominated Chinese politics during the period of division developed new strategies for maintaining influence that bypassed the examination system's emphasis on literary accomplishment and administrative competence. The decline in examination participation became evident through statistical analysis of successful candidates during the mid-9th century, which revealed significant decreases in both the number of applicants and the geographical diversity of those who achieved passing grades. Provinces under the control of autonomous military governors contributed fewer examination candidates, as local opportunities for advancement through military or commercial channels reduced the incentives for pursuing classical education and bureaucratic careers. The quality of examination supervision also deteriorated as regional authorities gained influence over local testing procedures and evaluation standards. Military governors who controlled examination sites could manipulate results to favour candidates from families that supported their political objectives, while the imperial government lacked sufficient oversight capacity to ensure consistent application of testing standards across different regions. These developments undermined the examination system's credibility as a mechanism for identifying the most qualified candidates for governmental service. The rise of hereditary privilege manifested most clearly in the increasing tendency for governmental positions to pass from fathers to sons regardless of individual qualifications or examination performance. Military commands, which had traditionally been assigned based on demonstrated competence and loyalty to imperial interests, became hereditary possessions that regional strongmen transferred to their designated heirs. The Chengde military region in Hebei province exemplified this trend, with the Wang family maintaining control over the governorship for 4 generations, despite periodic conflicts with imperial authority. Administrative positions within the central government also became increasingly dominated by members of established aristocratic families who possessed the political connections and financial resources necessary to navigate the complex patronage networks that determined career advancement. The Ministry of Personnel, responsible for official appointments and promotions, developed informal procedures that favoured candidates with family histories of governmental service over those whose primary qualification was examination success. The concentration of power among eunuchs within the imperial palace represented another dimension of the decline in central governmental authority during the mid-Tang period. Palace eunuchs, who had traditionally served ceremonial and administrative functions within the imperial household, began exercising direct influence over policy decisions and succession arrangements that extended far beyond their nominal responsibilities. Their unique position as the emperor's most intimate advisors, combined with their lack of family connections that might create conflicts of interest, initially made them valuable allies for rulers seeking to maintain independence from aristocratic factions. The eunuch influence reached unprecedented levels during the reigns of Emperors Xianzong and Muzong, when palace officials like Wang Shucheng and Chen Hongji effectively controlled access to the emperor, while managing the flow of information between the imperial court and governmental ministries. These individuals accumulated enormous personal wealth through their ability to influence imperial decisions regarding appointments, contracts, and policy directions, creating informal power networks that operated independently of established governmental procedures. The manipulation of imperial succession by eunuch factions represented the most dramatic manifestation of their growing political influence, as palace officials used their intimate knowledge of imperial family dynamics to advance candidates who would protect their interests once enthroned. The succession crisis following Emperor Xianzong's death in 820 AD demonstrated the extent to which eunuchs could determine dynastic continuity, as competing palace factions supported different imperial princes while engaging in violent confrontations that threatened governmental stability. The assassination of Emperor Xianzong, widely attributed to eunuch conspirators who feared the emperor's plans to reduce their influence, established a precedent for palace coups that would plague the late Tang period. Subsequent emperors found themselves dependent on eunuch support for physical security, while simultaneously recognizing that this dependence compromised their ability to implement independent policies or challenge established palace hierarchies. The economic difficulties accompanying these political developments reflected the cumulative impact of decades of warfare, administrative fragmentation, and fiscal mismanagement that had begun with the Anlushan rebellion and intensified throughout the 9th century. Inflation, caused partly by the monetary instability following the Buddhist persecution, and partly by the imperial government's continued reliance on currency debasement to fund military operations, created hardships for both urban consumers and rural producers who found their purchasing power steadily declining. Tax collection problems emerged as regional military commanders gained greater autonomy over fiscal administration within their territories, reducing the central government's access to revenues that had traditionally supported imperial operations and capital city maintenance. The twice-a-year tax system, which had provided stable income during the late 8th century, became increasingly difficult to implement as local officials prioritised regional needs over imperial requirements. The growing independence of military commissioners reflected the fundamental transformation of Chinese political organisation that had begun during the Anlushan rebellion and accelerated throughout the 9th century. Regional strongmen who had originally received imperial appointments to address specific military threats gradually evolved into hereditary rulers who maintained only nominal allegiance to the Tang Dynasty while exercising practical sovereignty over their territories. These military commissioners developed independent diplomatic relationships with neighbouring regions and foreign powers, conducted their own trade policies, and maintained military forces that served regional rather than imperial interests. The Pinglu military region established direct commercial relationships with Korean kingdoms, while the Xuanwu region developed trading partnerships with Central Asian merchants that bypassed imperial oversight and taxation. Such autonomous activities demonstrated the extent to which the Tang Empire had fragmented into a collection of semi-independent territories, united only by shared cultural traditions and ceremonial acknowledgement of imperial authority. The erosion of imperial authority that had accelerated throughout the mid-9th century created fertile conditions for the massive popular uprising that would ultimately destroy the Tang dynasty's capacity for effective governance. The Huangchao rebellion, erupting in 874 AD, emerged from a convergence of social, economic, and environmental crises that had been building for decades. Unlike the Anlushan rebellion, which had originated from elite military circles and maintained some connection to existing governmental structures, Huangchao's movement represented a genuine popular revolution that drew its strength from the accumulated grievances of farmers, artisans, and merchants who had suffered under the burden of excessive taxation, corrupt administration, and natural disasters. Huangchao himself embodied the social tensions that characterized late Tang society. Born around 835 AD into a merchant family in Taoju, modern-day Shandong province, he had received sufficient education to attempt the imperial examinations, but failed repeatedly to achieve the success that would have opened pathways to official advancement. His frustration with the examination system reflected broader concerns about the increasing dominance of established aristocratic families who used their political connections to secure governmental positions regardless of individual merit or examination performance. The salt trade, which had provided prosperity for Huangchao's family during the early 9th century, faced increasing governmental restrictions and taxation that reduced profit margins while creating opportunities for official corruption. The immediate catalyst for rebellion came from a series of natural disasters that devastated agricultural production throughout northern China during the early 870s. Severe droughts in 873 and 874 AD destroyed crops across multiple provinces, while locust swarms consumed remaining vegetation and created famine conditions that forced desperate farmers to abandon their land in search of food and employment. The Grand Canal, essential for transporting grain from productive southern regions to support northern populations, suffered from inadequate maintenance that reduced its carrying capacity precisely when transportation needs were most critical. The imperial government's response to these crises demonstrated the extent to which administrative capacity had deteriorated since the height of Tang power. Local officials, appointed through increasingly corrupt processes and accountable primarily to regional military commanders rather than central authority, proved incapable of organising effective disaster relief or maintaining public order as social conditions deteriorated. Granaries that should have contained emergency food supplies had been depleted through mismanagement and embezzlement, while transportation networks necessary for distributing aid had fallen into disrepair due to inadequate funding and supervision. The salt monopoly system, which had provided crucial revenues for the imperial government since the late 8th century, became a particular source of popular resentment as officials used their regulatory authority to extract bribes from merchants while imposing arbitrary restrictions that disrupted traditional trading patterns. Huang Chao's family business suffered directly from these policies, as salt traders faced increasing demands for unofficial payments to local officials while competing with government-sponsored merchants who received preferential treatment through their political connections. The monopoly's enforcement created a class of disaffected commercial families who possessed both the resources and organisational skills necessary to support anti-governmental activities. Huang Chao's initial rebellion began in December 874 AD with an attack on government salt warehouses in his home region, an action that symbolically challenged imperial fiscal policies while providing material resources for expanding his movement. His early followers included fellow salt merchants, displaced farmers, and unemployed artisans who shared grievances against governmental policies that had destroyed their livelihoods while enriching corrupt officials and their aristocratic patrons. The rebellion's commercial origins distinguished it from typical peasant uprisings, as Huang Chao's supporters possessed literacy, organisational experience, and financial resources that enabled more sophisticated planning and coordination than purely agricultural movements could achieve. The rebel forces' rapid expansion throughout Shandong province during early 875 AD revealed the extent of popular discontent with Tang governmental policies and the weakness of imperial military responses. Local garrison troops, poorly equipped and irregularly paid, offered minimal resistance to rebel attacks on county seats and administrative centres. Many soldiers deserted rather than fight against forces that included their own relatives and neighbours, while others joined the rebellion when promised better treatment and regular compensation for their military service. The rebels' ability to recruit experienced military personnel provided them with tactical knowledge and leadership capabilities that transformed their movement from a desperate uprising into an effective fighting force. Huang Chao's military organisation reflected both his commercial background and his understanding of the governmental weaknesses that could be exploited for strategic advantage. Unlike traditional peasant rebellions that relied primarily on overwhelming numbers and desperate courage, his forces developed sophisticated logistics systems that could support extended campaigns across multiple provinces. Rebel quartermasters, drawn from the merchant community's experienced traders, established supply networks that provided food, weapons, and other necessities while maintaining the mobility necessary for avoiding concentration of imperial forces against them. The rebellion's expansion beyond its original base in Shandong demonstrated Huang Chao's strategic vision and his ability to adapt his movement's appeal to different regional constituencies. As rebel forces moved south into the Yangtze River Valley during 876 AD, they encountered populations with different economic structures and political grievances than the northern salt trading communities where the uprising had originated. Huang Chao's propaganda adapted to these circumstances, emphasizing themes of social equality and opposition to aristocratic privilege that resonated with agricultural workers and urban craftsmen who had suffered under the burden of excessive taxation and corrupt administration. The rebels' capture of Guangzhou in December 878 AD marked a crucial turning point that transformed their movement from a regional uprising into a threat to imperial survival. Guangzhou, serving as the empire's primary port for international trade, contained enormous wealth accumulated through commercial relationships with Southeast Asian kingdoms, Arab merchants, and other foreign trading partners. The city's cosmopolitan population included thousands of foreign residents whose presence had created cultural diversity and economic prosperity that attracted Chinese migrants from throughout the empire. The massacre that accompanied Guangzhou's capture revealed the darker aspects of Huang Chao's movement and its evolution from a commercially oriented rebellion into a destructive force driven by class hatred and ethnic resentment. Rebel forces systematically killed foreign merchants, particularly Arabs and Persians, who had accumulated substantial wealth through their trading activities, while destroying temples, warehouses, and residential districts associated with international commerce. Contemporary accounts suggest that over 100,000 foreign residents died during the 3-day rampage that followed the city's fall, effectively ending Guangzhou's role as a centre for international trade and cultural exchange. The destruction of Guangzhou demonstrated the rebellion's transformation from a movement seeking governmental reform into a revolutionary force committed to destroying the existing social and economic order. Huang Chao's forces had evolved beyond their original grievances against salt monopoly policies and examination system corruption to embrace a radical vision that rejected the cosmopolitan culture and international relationships that had characterized Tang civilization at its height. This ideological shift attracted additional support from populations that resented foreign influence and aristocratic privilege, but it also alienated potential allies who might have supported more moderate reform objectives. The rebel advance toward Chang'an during 879 AD proceeded through territories where Tang governmental authority had already collapsed due to decades of military fragmentation and administrative incompetence. Regional military commissioners, focused on protecting their own territories and maintaining their autonomous authority, proved unwilling to coordinate effective resistance against forces that threatened the imperial capital but did not immediately challenge their local interests. The rebels' ability to traverse multiple military regions without encountering serious opposition demonstrated the extent to which the Tang Empire had fragmented into competing power centres that prioritised regional over imperial concerns. Emperor Xizong's court, faced with Huang Chao's approaching army, responded with the same panicked evacuation strategy that had characterised imperial reactions to the Anlushan rebellion over a century earlier. The emperor's flight from Chang'an in December 880 AD, accompanied by a reduced entourage of court officials and palace personnel, symbolised the complete breakdown of central governmental authority and the dynasty's inability to defend even its most essential territories. The evacuation's hasty nature meant that valuable records, artworks, and other cultural treasures were abandoned to rebel forces who showed little interest in preserving the accumulated achievements of Tang civilization. Huang Chao's occupation of Chang'an in January 881 AD provided his movement with symbolic legitimacy while revealing the practical challenges of governing territories that had been conquered through destructive warfare. The rebel leader's proclamation of a new dynasty called Qi, with himself as emperor, represented an attempt to transform his revolutionary movement into a legitimate governmental system capable of administering the vast territories under his control. However, the rebels' background as merchants and displaced farmers provided limited preparation for the complex administrative tasks required to govern the Chinese Empire's sophisticated society and economy. The new regime's policies reflected both Huang Chao's commercial origins and his movement's revolutionary ideology, creating contradictions that undermined efforts to establish stable governance. Attempts to eliminate aristocratic privilege and redistribute wealth appealed to the rebellion's popular supporters, but created administrative chaos as experienced officials fled or were executed, leaving governmental functions without qualified personnel. The rebels' hostility toward foreign merchants and international trade disrupted commercial networks that had provided essential revenues for imperial operations, while their destruction of cultural institutions eliminated sources of legitimacy that had traditionally supported Chinese governmental authority. The systematic destruction of Chang'an's palaces, temples, and residential districts during the rebel occupation represented one of the most devastating cultural losses in Chinese history. Huang Chao's forces, driven by class hatred and resentment against aristocratic luxury, systematically destroyed buildings, artworks, and libraries that represented centuries of accumulated cultural achievement. The Daming Palace's throne hall, which had served as the ceremonial centre of Tang imperial authority, was stripped of its decorative elements before being burned, while the Imperial Library's collection of classical texts and historical records was scattered or destroyed. The rebellion's impact on Chang'an's population proved equally catastrophic, as rebel forces engaged in systematic massacres of aristocratic families, government officials, and foreign residents who were viewed as representatives of the corrupt social order that the movement sought to eliminate. Contemporary accounts describe streets filled with corpses and entire districts reduced to ruins, while surviving residents fled to rural areas or sought refuge in territories controlled by regional military commanders who maintained some semblance of order. The collapse of governmental authority in the imperial capital created opportunities for regional military commissioners to assert greater independence while positioning themselves as protectors of traditional Chinese civilization against the rebels' destructive radicalism. Li Keong, the military governor of Hedong, emerged as the most effective imperial loyalist, commanding Shatuo cavalry units whose fighting effectiveness exceeded that of traditional Chinese military formations. His forces included experienced nomadic warriors whose tactical skills and mobility advantages proved crucial in confronting rebel armies that had grown overconfident through their early successes. The Shatuo cavalry's intervention in the conflict represented another example of the Tang Dynasty's dependence on foreign military assistance to address internal challenges, continuing a pattern that had begun with Uyghur support during the Andalusian Rebellion. Li Keong's troops, ethnically Turkic but culturally assimilated to Chinese military traditions, provided the imperial cause with fighting capabilities that native Chinese forces could no longer match. Their success in defeating rebel armies demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of nomadic military techniques and the extent to which the Tang military system had deteriorated since the dynasty's founding. The gradual reconquest of territories controlled by Huang Chao's forces began in 882 AD as imperial loyalist armies, supported by Shatuo cavalry and regional military units, launched coordinated attacks against rebel strongholds throughout northern China. The rebels' lack of experience in defensive warfare became apparent as they proved unable to maintain control over territories that had been conquered through rapid offensive campaigns. Their revolutionary ideology, which had provided motivation during the initial uprising, proved inadequate for inspiring the sustained resistance necessary to defend fixed positions against experienced military opponents. Huang Chao's death in June 884 AD, killed by his own nephew Huang Kun during a desperate attempt to escape pursuing loyalist forces, mark the formal end of the rebellion that had devastated the Tang Empire for nearly a decade. However, the uprising's conclusion brought little relief to territories that had suffered through years of warfare, administrative collapse, and economic disruption. The systematic destruction of governmental infrastructure, combined with massive population displacement and the breakdown of commercial networks, created conditions that would prevent meaningful imperial recovery for the remainder of the Tang period. The rebellion's aftermath revealed the permanent transformation of Chinese political organization that had occurred during the 9 years of conflict. Regional military commanders who had supported imperial restoration efforts expected substantial rewards for their loyalty, including expanded territorial authority and reduced obligations to central governmental control. The imperial court, weakened by years of exile and dependent on military allies for its survival, lacked the resources and authority necessary to resist these demands for greater autonomy. The emergence of warlordism as the dominant form of political organization throughout much of the former Tang Empire reflected the complete breakdown of centralized administrative systems that had characterized Chinese governance for over 2 centuries. Military strongmen who controlled specific territories began functioning as independent rulers, maintaining their own armies, collecting taxes for their exclusive use, and conducting diplomatic relationships with neighboring regions without reference to imperial authority. The fiction of Tang governmental unity persisted through ceremonial submissions and nominal imperial appointments, but real power had devolved to regional commanders whose loyalty depended entirely on their individual calculations of personal advantage. The Zhuwen faction, which emerged from the remnants of Huang Chao's forces, exemplified this transformation as former rebels reorganized themselves into a conventional military organization that competed for territorial control with other regional powers. Zhu Wen's ability to maintain effective governance over territories in modern-day Henan province demonstrated that successful warlords required more than military competence, needing administrative skills and political legitimacy that could attract popular support and elite cooperation. The disintegration of the Tang administrative system accelerated as the imperial government lost effective control over most of its former territories, retaining direct authority only over a small area surrounding the reconstructed capital at Chang'an. The 3 chancelleries and 6 ministries structure, which had provided the framework for Chinese imperial administration since the 7th century, continued operating in name, but lack the territorial jurisdiction and financial resources necessary for meaningful governmental functions. Provincial governors and county magistrates throughout most of the empire answered to regional military commanders rather than imperial officials, creating a fragmented administrative landscape that bore little resemblance to the unified system that had characterized Tang governance at its height. The examination system's virtual collapse during this period eliminated one of the few remaining mechanisms for maintaining cultural and administrative unity across the empire's diverse regions. Regional military commanders, focused on immediate military and political challenges, showed little interest in supporting educational institutions or scholarly activities that might produce qualified administrators, but provided no immediate practical benefits. The absence of regular examinations meant that governmental positions were filled through personal connections and military appointments, rather than demonstrated competence or classical learning, further reducing the quality of administrative personnel available for governmental functions. The cultural and intellectual devastation accompanying the administrative collapse extended beyond mere governmental dysfunction to encompass the systematic destruction of educational institutions, libraries, and scholarly networks that had sustained Chinese civilization for centuries. The Imperial Academy system, which had trained thousands of officials and maintained scholarly traditions since the early Tang period, ceased functioning as regional military commanders redirected resources toward immediate military needs rather than long-term cultural preservation. Private academies, dependent on aristocratic patronage and stable social conditions, closed as their sponsors fled warten regions or lost their wealth through confiscation and destruction. The dispersal of scholarly communities created a brain drain that affected every aspect of Chinese intellectual life, from historical record-keeping to technological innovation. Court historians who had maintained detailed chronicles of imperial activities and governmental decisions scattered to remote regions where they struggled to continue their work without access to official documents and library collections. The systematic destruction of archives during the Huangchao Rebellion meant that crucial governmental precedents and legal interpretations were lost forever, forcing subsequent administrators to operate without the accumulated wisdom that had guided Chinese governance for generations. Technological knowledge suffered similar disruption as artisan communities that had developed sophisticated manufacturing techniques were displaced by warfare and economic collapse. The imperial workshops that had produced luxury goods, weapons, and architectural materials for governmental use were abandoned or destroyed, while the skilled craftsmen who had operated them sought employment in regions where their specialized knowledge remained valued. The loss of these technical capabilities affected everything from military equipment production to the maintenance of irrigation systems essential for agricultural productivity. The breakdown of communication networks that had connected distant regions of the empire eliminated one of the fundamental mechanisms through which Chinese cultural unity had been maintained. The postal relay system, which had enabled rapid transmission of official documents and private correspondence across thousands of miles, collapsed as regional military commanders appropriated horses and personnel for their own military operations. Without reliable communication channels, different regions began developing divergent practices and customs that reflected local conditions rather than empire-wide standards. Emperor Xizong's return to Chang'an in 885 AD revealed the extent of destruction that had occurred during the rebel occupation and the enormous challenges facing any attempt to restore meaningful imperial authority. The capital's population had declined from over 1 million residents to fewer than 100,000, while entire districts remained uninhabitable due to fire damage and structural collapse. The imperial palace complex required complete reconstruction, as rebel forces had systematically destroyed buildings, gardens, and ceremonial facilities that had served as symbols of Tang governmental authority for over 2 centuries. The emperor's court, reduced to a few hundred officials and palace personnel, operated from temporary buildings while attempting to re-establish the basic governmental functions necessary for imperial administration. The absence of experienced administrators, combined with the loss of governmental records and legal precedents, meant that even routine decisions required extensive consultation and improvisation. Tax collection procedures, appointment protocols, and judicial processes that had operated smoothly for generations needed to be reconstructed from fragmentary memories and incomplete documentation. The fiscal crisis facing the restored imperial government proved even more challenging than the administrative reconstruction, as traditional revenue sources had been destroyed or appropriated by regional military commanders who refused to acknowledge central governmental authority. The equal field system, already weakened by demographic changes and territorial fragmentation, had completely collapsed in most regions as warfare displaced farming populations and destroyed the cadastral records necessary for land allocation and tax assessment. The salt monopoly, which had provided crucial revenues during the 8th and early 9th centuries, generated minimal income as regional authorities established their own taxation systems that bypassed imperial control. The twice-a-year tax system, implemented during the late 8th century to address similar fiscal challenges, proved impossible to enforce as local officials owed their positions to regional military commanders rather than imperial appointment. Provincial governors who maintained nominal loyalty to the Tang Dynasty retained most collected revenues for their own use, forwarding only token payments to the imperial treasury while claiming that local military expenses consumed available resources. This arrangement left the central government dependent on irregular contributions from loyal regions and forced loans from wealthy merchants who demanded political concessions in exchange for financial support. The military challenges facing Emperor Xizong's government reflected the fundamental transformation of Chinese warfare that had occurred during the decades of rebellion and fragmentation. The Fubing system, which had provided the foundation for Tang military success during the 7th and 8th centuries, had completely disappeared as agricultural disruption and population displacement eliminated the rural communities that had supplied soldier farmers. Professional military units, maintained through direct governmental funding, required resources that the impoverished imperial treasury could not provide, while regional military commanders controlled the most effective fighting forces in the empire. The Shatuo cavalry units under Li Qiong's command represented the most reliable military support available to the imperial government, though their effectiveness came at the cost of increased dependence on foreign military assistance. These Turkic warriors, numbering approximately 30,000 experienced horsemen, possessed tactical capabilities that exceeded those of traditional Chinese military formations, but their loyalty depended on regular payment and political concessions that strained imperial resources. Li Qiong's growing autonomy within his Hedong military region demonstrated how even loyal military commanders accumulated independent authority that limited imperial control over their activities. The proliferation of autonomous military regions throughout the former Tang Empire created a complex political landscape where nominal imperial unity coexisted with practical fragmentation among dozens of independent territories. The Xuanwu military region under Zhu Wen controlled strategic territories in modern-day Henan province, while maintaining sophisticated administrative systems that rivaled those of the imperial government. The Huainan region under Yang Xingmi governed prosperous agricultural areas along the Yangtze River, while developing independent diplomatic relationships with neighbouring territories and foreign powers. These regional powers operated their own governmental systems, including tax collection, judicial administration, and military recruitment, while maintaining the fiction of imperial subordination through periodic tribute payments and ceremonial submissions. Their administrative capabilities often exceeded those of the weakened central government, as regional rulers could focus their resources on governing coherent territories rather than attempting to coordinate activities across the empire's vast expanse. The success of these autonomous regions in maintaining order and prosperity within their boundaries highlighted the practical limitations of centralized imperial governance under post-rebellion conditions. The succession of Emperor Zhaozong in 888 AD brought to the throne a ruler who possessed greater energy and political awareness than his predecessor, though he inherited governmental and military challenges that had become virtually insurmountable. The new emperor, 21 years old at his accession, had observed the dynasty's decline during his youth, and understood that dramatic reforms would be necessary to restore meaningful imperial authority. His early reign witnessed attempts to reassert central control over regional military commanders through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and administrative reorganization. Zhaozong's efforts to rebuild imperial military capabilities included attempts to recruit and train new army units that could operate independently of regional military commanders whose loyalty remained questionable. The emperor established military academies designed to produce officers loyal to imperial rather than regional interests, while implementing new recruitment procedures that drew soldiers from areas under direct governmental control. These initiatives achieved limited success due to financial constraints and the superior resources available to established regional powers, but they demonstrated the emperor's recognition that military reform was essential for governmental restoration. The emperor's administrative reforms focused on rebuilding the examination system and governmental bureaucracy that had provided the foundation for Tang administrative excellence during the dynasty's peak periods. New examination procedures emphasized practical administrative skills rather than purely literary accomplishments, while recruitment efforts targeted educated individuals from regions that remained loyal to imperial authority. The establishment of new governmental schools provided training opportunities for potential administrators, though their limited scope meant that they could not address the empire-wide shortage of qualified personnel. Zhaozong's diplomatic initiatives attempted to exploit tensions among regional military commanders, while building coalitions that could support imperial restoration efforts. The emperor's court maintained extensive correspondence with autonomous regional rulers, offering political concessions and commercial privileges in exchange for acknowledgement of imperial authority and cooperation in addressing common challenges. These negotiations achieved occasional tactical successes, but failed to produce the sustained cooperation necessary for meaningful governmental unification. The environmental and demographic challenges of the late 9th century compounded the political and military difficulties facing the imperial government, as natural disasters and continued warfare prevented the population recovery necessary for economic restoration. Severe flooding along the Yellow River in 889 AD displaced hundreds of thousands of farming families while destroying agricultural infrastructure that had supported regional food production for centuries. The Grand Canal system, essential for transporting grain between different regions of the empire, suffered from inadequate maintenance that reduced its carrying capacity precisely when transportation needs were most critical. Population levels throughout the former Tang Empire remained far below pre-rebellion figures, as warfare, disease, and economic disruption had created demographic catastrophe from which recovery proved extremely difficult. Urban centres that had flourished during the Kaiyuan period struggled to maintain basic services and commercial activities, while rural areas faced labour shortages that reduced agricultural productivity and tax revenues. The breakdown of family structures and social networks that had provided stability during previous periods of difficulty meant that communities lacked the institutional resources necessary for coordinated recovery efforts. The cultural impact of these demographic changes extended beyond immediate practical concerns to affect the transmission of knowledge and traditions that had defined Chinese civilization for centuries. Craft techniques, literary traditions, and religious practices that had been passed down through family and community networks were lost as social disruption eliminated the stable conditions necessary for cultural continuity. The absence of educational institutions and scholarly communities meant that younger generations grew up without access to the classical learning that had provided the foundation for Chinese intellectual and administrative traditions. The economic consequences of prolonged warfare and governmental fragmentation created conditions that prevented the commercial recovery necessary for supporting complex governmental operations. Trade networks that had connected different regions of the empire and facilitated cultural exchange were disrupted by political boundaries and military conflicts that made long-distance commerce dangerous and unprofitable. The Silk Road connections that had brought prosperity to Central Asian territories under Tang control were severed as regional military commanders imposed their own taxation and regulatory systems that discouraged international trade. Manufacturing industries that had produced luxury goods for domestic consumption and international export declined as skilled artisans dispersed and raw material supplies became unreliable. The ceramic workshops that had created Tang Sankai pottery, prized throughout Asia for its technical excellence and artistic beauty, ceased production as demand collapsed and transportation networks failed. Silk production, which had provided both domestic prosperity and international prestige for Chinese civilization, suffered from the disruption of mulberry cultivation and the loss of weaving techniques that required specialized knowledge and stable working conditions. Agricultural productivity, the foundation of Chinese economic life, remained far below pre-rebellion levels as continued warfare and population displacement prevented the restoration of intensive cultivation techniques that had supported the empire's demographic growth during the 8th century. The equal field system's collapse meant that land distribution occurred through ad hoc arrangements that often failed to provide farmers with sufficient acreage or security of tenure necessary for long-term agricultural investment. Irrigation systems that had supported intensive agriculture in key regions suffered from inadequate maintenance and deliberate destruction during military campaigns. The monetary system that had facilitated commercial transactions throughout the empire experienced severe disruption as regional authorities began minting their own coins, while imperial currency lost credibility due to debasement and irregular supply. The bronze coinage that had provided stable medium of exchange for centuries became unreliable, as different regions produced coins with varying metal content and weight standards. Barter transactions increasingly replaced monetary exchange in many areas, reducing commercial efficiency while limiting the scope of economic relationships that could be maintained across political boundaries. Emperor Zhaozong's attempts to address these multifaceted challenges through governmental reform and military action achieved limited success due to the fundamental transformation of Chinese political organization that had occurred during the previous decades of fragmentation. The emperor's authority, confined to a small territory surrounding the reconstructed capital, lacked the territorial base and resource access necessary for implementing empire-wide policies or coordinating large-scale military campaigns. Regional military commanders, comfortable with their autonomous authority and suspicious of imperial attempts to reduce their independence, resisted central governmental initiatives while maintaining their own territorial interests. The growing influence of powerful court eunuchs during Zhaozong's reign reflected the emperor's weakness and his dependence on palace personnel, who could provide personal security while managing the complex political relationships necessary for imperial survival. Eunuch officials like Liu Jishu and Wang Zhongwen accumulated enormous influence over imperial decision-making, while developing their own networks of supporters and clients throughout the reduced imperial administration. Their manipulation of court politics and imperial appointments created additional instability as competing eunuch factions pursued conflicting objectives that often contradicted broader imperial interests. The assassination of Emperor Zhaozong on August 13, 904 AD, by soldiers acting on orders from the warlord Zhu Wen, eliminated the last Tang ruler who had possessed both the personal capability and institutional position necessary for meaningful governmental restoration. Zhu Wen's decision to murder the emperor reflected his calculation that Zhaozong's continued attempts to reassert imperial authority threatened the autonomous regional power that he had built during the previous 2 decades of fragmentation. The assassination occurred in Luoyang, where the emperor had been residing under what amounted to house arrest, while Zhu Wen consolidated his control over the remaining imperial territories. The installation of Li Ju, Zhaozong's 13-year-old son, as Emperor Ai represented Zhu Wen's attempt to maintain the fiction of imperial legitimacy while exercising real authority through his control over the puppet ruler. The young emperor's complete dependence on Zhu Wen's military protection and administrative support eliminated any possibility of independent imperial action, while the warlord's control over court appointments and policy decisions reduced the imperial government to a ceremonial institution that legitimized his regional authority. This arrangement satisfied Zhu Wen's immediate political needs, while providing him with time to prepare for the formal establishment of his own dynasty. The manipulation of Emperor Ai during his brief reign demonstrated the extent to which imperial authority had become subordinated to the military power of regional strongmen, who maintained the Tang Dynasty's existence only as long as it served their political purposes. Court ceremonies continued according to traditional protocols, while governmental ministries maintained their nominal functions under the supervision of officials appointed by Zhu Wen rather than through established imperial procedures. The young emperor's isolation within the palace complex, surrounded by guards loyal to Zhu Wen rather than imperial interests, symbolized the complete subordination of dynastic authority to warlord power. The final act of this political transformation occurred on April 18, 907 AD, when Zhu Wen forced Emperor Ai to abdicate in his favour, formally ending the Tang Dynasty after 289 years of rule. The abdication ceremony, conducted in Luoyang with appropriate ritual formalities, transferred imperial authority to Zhu Wen, who established the later Liang dynasty as the first of the 5 dynasties that would compete for control over northern China during the subsequent period of political fragmentation. The young former emperor's death shortly after his abdication, almost certainly by assassination, eliminated the last potential focal point for Tang loyalist resistance. The establishment of the later Liang dynasty marked the beginning of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a time of unprecedented political fragmentation that would last until the Song dynasty's reunification of China in 960 AD. Zhu Wen's new regime controlled only a fraction of the territory that had comprised the Tang Empire at its height, while independent kingdoms in southern China and autonomous military regions in the north maintained their own governmental systems and territorial boundaries. The cultural unity that had characterized Chinese civilization during the Tang period gave way to regional diversity as different areas developed distinct political traditions and social practices. The Tang dynasty's collapse represented more than the end of a particular ruling house. It marked the conclusion of an era in Chinese history when centralized imperial government had successfully integrated diverse populations across vast territories while maintaining cultural coherence and administrative effectiveness. The dynasty's achievements in poetry, painting, sculpture and architecture had established standards of artistic excellence that would influence Chinese civilization for centuries, while its governmental innovations had created administrative systems that subsequent dynasties would adapt and refine. The cosmopolitan character of Tang society, with its acceptance of foreign influences and international relationships, had demonstrated the possibilities for cultural synthesis and intellectual exchange that would inspire later periods of Chinese openness to external ideas and practices. The dynasty's ultimate failure reflected the inherent tensions within Chinese imperial governance between centralized authority and regional autonomy, between cultural unity and local diversity, and between the demands of governing vast territories and the limitations of pre-modern administrative and communication technologies. The Anlushan rebellion had revealed these structural weaknesses, while the subsequent century of fragmentation and decline had demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining imperial unity once the balance between central and regional authority had been disrupted. The Tang Dynasty's legacy would endure through its cultural achievements and governmental innovations, but its political structure had proven unable to adapt to the challenges of governing an increasingly complex and diverse society across the enormous geographical expanse of the Chinese Empire.